My name is Simone, and at 32 years old, I walked into my younger sister's $1 million wedding reception, only to have my own father publicly introduce me to the groom's wealthy family as an unemployed freeloader. What my father did not realize as he mocked me in front of the Atlanta elite was that I had just secretly purchased the entire media conglomerate that employed his precious golden child, and she was about to be publicly fired before the wedding cake was even cut. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family members who constantly underestimated your true worth. The grand ballroom of the Four Seasons Hotel in Atlanta was a breathtaking display of excessive wealth and desperate social climbing. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over hundreds of guests, dressed in custom couture and tailored tuxedos. Thousands of white orchids and imported roses cascaded from towering centerpieces, filling the air with a heavy, intoxicating floral scent. A live jazz band played softly in one corner, providing an elegant soundtrack to the clinking of champagne flutes and the hushed, calculating conversations of the city's most powerful socialites. This was not just a celebration of love. It was a carefully orchestrated performance designed to elevate my family's social standing within the tight-knit circles of the elite. My younger sister Tiara was marrying Julian, a man whose family name carried generations of old money prestige in Georgia. For my parents, Desmond and Valerie, this wedding was their ultimate triumph. They had spent their entire lives obsessing over status appearances and the approval of the upper class. Tiara had always been their golden child, the perfect daughter who followed their every command, landed a high-profile job as a senior director at a prestigious public relations agency, and secured a wealthy, well-connected husband. I, on the other hand, was the family disappointment. Because I had refused to pursue a career in medicine and instead chose my own unpredictable path, my father had labeled me a failure. He genuinely believed I was jobless, and struggling, utterly unaware that I had spent the last decade building a ruthless reputation as a venture capitalist. While they were busy chasing party invitations, I was quietly acquiring media empires and restructuring massive corporations from the shadows. When my firm finalized the purchase of Tiara's agency just 72 hours ago, I had ordered a full forensic audit of their accounts. What my auditors found was a massive trail of blatant, sloppy embezzlement leading directly to my sister's desk. She had been quietly siphoning funds to pay for the very floral arrangements, the vintage champagne, and the custom bridal gown currently on display in this room. I stepped through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom wearing a sleek, unbranded emerald green gown that drew subtle, admiring glances from the crowd. I did not come to cause a scene or disrupt the festivities. I came out of a lingering, perhaps foolish sense of family obligation. I held a crisp white envelope in my hand, containing a generous monetary gift for the newlyweds. But I barely had time to take in the opulent surroundings before the hostility began. Desmond spotted me from across the room. His eyes narrowed instantly, his face tightening with an ugly mixture of panic and deep-seated disdain. He excused himself abruptly from a group of local politicians and marched directly toward me, his strides long and aggressive. He did not offer a greeting. He did not smile. Before I could even speak a word of congratulation, he lunged forward and violently snatched the gift envelope right out of my hands. "What do you think you are doing here?" he hissed, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper designed to evade the ears of the nearby guests. "I thought we made it abundantly clear that you were only invited to the church ceremony, not the reception. We cannot have you ruining this night for your sister with your depressing energy." "I am here to drop off my gift and congratulate the bride," I replied, my voice perfectly level and devoid of any intimidation. My father scoffed, looking me up and down with open contempt. "Congratulate her or beg for a handout? We all know you have not held a real job in years. I will not let your pathetic situation drag down our family name tonight, especially not in front of Julian's esteemed parents." Instead of simply asking me to leave, Desmond's eyes darted toward the front of the room. A twisted, cruel idea seemed to form in his mind. He grabbed my upper arm, his grip tight and punishing, and began to forcefully drag me across the ballroom floor. I could have pulled away, I could have caused a massive scene right there near the entrance screaming for security. But I chose to let him lead. I wanted to see exactly how far he was willing to push his false narrative. I wanted to witness the absolute peak of his arrogance before gravity took over. Every step across that polished floor was a reminder of why I had distanced myself from them. Growing up, the dynamic had always been the same. If I achieved something remarkable, it was ignored or minimized. When I secured full academic scholarships, my parents claimed it was expected. But when Tiara managed to barely pass her classes, they threw lavish parties to celebrate her mediocrity. They fed her ego until she genuinely believed the world revolved around her desires. My parents had funded her lavish lifestyle, covering up her endless mistakes, and bailing her out of every financial disaster, all while criticizing my decision to build my wealth independently. They worshipped the idea of Tiara the beautiful, socially adept daughter who would eventually marry into true wealth and elevate the Washington name to the upper echelons of Atlanta society. He pulled me past tables of whispering guests, past the towering ice sculptures, and the lavish stations of expensive caviar. Every step was a silent declaration of his dominance over the outcast daughter. We approached the VIP table situated right next to the massive polished dance floor. Seated there were Julian's parents, an intimidating couple dripping with generational wealth and practiced superiority. They looked up as my father approached, their expressions politely detached, but observant. At the head table, situated just a few feet away, Tiara sat in her custom bridal gown. She caught sight of us approaching. A cruel, knowing smirk spread across her perfectly made-up face. She lifted her crystal champagne flute, taking a slow, dramatic sip as she watched her father drag her older sister into the lion's den. Desmond stopped abruptly in front of the wealthy in-laws, releasing my arm with a slight, degrading shove forward. He plastered on his most charming, deferential smile for them, completely altering his previously aggressive demeanor. "My deepest apologies for the interruption to your wonderful dinner," Desmond announced, his voice booming artificially loud so that the surrounding tables could hear every single word. "I just wanted to introduce you to the rest of the family before the speeches begin. This is my eldest daughter, Simone." Julian's mother offered a tight, obligatory smile, nodding slightly in my direction. But my father was not finished. He turned to me, his eyes flashing with malicious triumph, and then looked back to the groom's parents. "I must apologize in advance for her appearance and her presence here," Desmond continued, making sure his voice carried clearly over the smooth jazz music. "Simone is our unemployed freeloader. She has always struggled to find her footing in the real world, completely unlike our brilliant, successful Tiara. Let us just hope she does not eat too much of your expensive lobster tonight. After all, she rarely gets to see food like this in her daily life." The air in the ballroom seemed to instantly evaporate. The jazz band continued playing, but the conversations at the surrounding tables died immediately. Several guests gasped audibly, covering their mouths in shock. Julian's parents exchanged a look of pure, unadulterated discomfort, clearly appalled by the profound lack of class my father had just displayed. Julian's mother carefully set down her silver fork, her lips pressed into a thin line of absolute disapproval. At the head table, Tiara's smirk widened into a full, beaming grin. She was basking in my public humiliation, reveling in the fact that her special day included the complete social destruction of her older sister. For years, this exact type of public shaming had been their favorite weapon against me. They expected me to shrink, to cry, to run out of the room in tears, leaving them to shake their heads and murmur apologies about my fragile mental state. They expected me to play the familiar role of the broken, defeated scapegoat they had assigned to me since childhood. They wanted me to confirm every lie they had ever told about me. But I was no longer the frightened girl seeking their validation. I was a woman who commanded corporate boardrooms. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice or frantically try to defend myself against his ridiculous, degrading claims. I stood there, my posture completely straight, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute chilling calm. I looked directly into my father's eyes and I simply smiled. It was not a smile of submission or embarrassment. It was a cold, unnerving smile of pure concentrated power. A waiter dressed in a crisp black vest passed by our table carrying a silver tray of drinks. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I calmly reached out and took a glass of champagne. I took a slow, deliberate sip. The crisp, expensive liquid slid down my throat as the silence around the VIP table stretched into a heavy, suffocating tension. My total lack of reaction confused Desmond. His arrogant grin faltered slightly, replaced by a rapid flicker of uncertainty. He shifted his weight, suddenly hyper-aware of the wealthy in-laws staring at him with thinly veiled disgust. He had intended to humiliate me, but my total indifference had turned the awkwardness entirely back onto him. I did not need to speak. My silence was a psychological weapon, drawing the moment out, forcing him to stew in the awkward, heavy atmosphere he had created with his own cruelty. I knew something he did not know. I knew that his carefully constructed world of status superiority and lies was living on borrowed time, and the clock was about to run out. I held my champagne glass completely unbothered as the music played on, waiting for the true guest of honor to arrive and shatter my family's delusion forever. The sea of designer gowns and tailored tuxedos parted seamlessly as Kendrick stepped onto the polished dance floor. At 45 years old, the CEO of Atlanta's most prestigious public relations agency commanded the kind of respect that money alone could not buy. He moved with the predatory grace of a man who held the keys to the city's corporate media machine. Everyone in the high society circuit knew his face. Everyone knew the ruthless efficiency with which he destroyed careers and built empires. The soft jazz music continued to play, providing an ironically smooth soundtrack to his sudden sharp arrival at the edge of the VIP section. Desmond spotted him instantly. The transformation in my father was both immediate and pathetic. The cruel, mocking sneer he had weaponized against me vanished, replaced by an oily, desperate sycophancy that radiated from his every pore. He completely abandoned his attempt to humiliate me. His entire focus shifted to the incoming billionaire. He smoothed the lapels of his rented tuxedo, puffed out his chest, and eagerly stepped directly into Kendrick's path. He thrust his right hand forward, his teeth bared in a blindingly eager smile, designed to impress Julian's wealthy old money parents, seated just inches away. "Kendrick, it is a tremendous honor to have you here tonight," Desmond announced loudly, his voice practically vibrating with desperate social climbing. "We are absolutely thrilled that you could take time out of your incredibly busy schedule to celebrate Tiara's special day. She speaks of your leadership constantly. As her father, I want to personally thank you for recognizing her unparalleled brilliance." The air in the ballroom grew thick. Julian's parents watched this display of blatant brown nosing with thinly veiled distaste. At the head table, Tiara leaned forward in her custom bridal gown, her chest swelling with pride. She anticipated a public endorsement from her powerful boss, a crowning moment of corporate validation to cap off her $1 million wedding. Kendrick did not slow his pace. He did not extend his hand to meet my father's eager grasp. He did not even offer a polite nod of acknowledgement. He simply walked right past Desmond, as if my father were nothing more than a misplaced piece of furniture. The physical bypass was so absolute, so entirely dismissive, that Desmond stumbled slightly, his outstretched hand left hanging awkwardly in the empty air. A collective suppressed gasp rippled through the nearby tables of Atlanta elites. In their world, a public snub of this magnitude was a lethal social execution. Kendrick stopped directly in front of me. The surrounding crowd held its collective breath. I did not lower my champagne glass. I met his gaze with the calm, unwavering authority of a predator surveying its territory. Kendrick closed the distance between us and, to the absolute horror of everyone watching, bowed his head in a deep, unmistakable gesture of total submission. "Ms. Washington," Kendrick said, his voice carrying the distinct heavy weight of absolute reverence. "It is an absolute honor to have our new board chairwoman here tonight. I wanted to personally ensure your arrival was accommodated to your exact specifications." The silence that descended upon the ballroom was absolute. The clinking of crystal flutes ceased entirely. The hushed whispers died in the throats of the surrounding guests. Even the jazz band seemed to miss a beat, the saxophone faltering for a fraction of a second before recovering. Desmond let out a sharp, barking laugh. It was a nervous, jagged sound that echoed painfully in the quiet room. He stepped back toward us, his face twisting into an expression of desperate, confused denial. He firmly believed Kendrick had made a catastrophic error. "I believe there is a bit of a mix-up here, Kendrick." Desmond chuckled, his voice cracking with anxiety as he pointed frantically toward the head table. "You are confusing my daughters. The bride over there is Tiara. She is your senior director. This is Simone. She is unemployed. She has not held a real position in years. You certainly do not work for her." Kendrick slowly turned his head to look at my father. The look in his eyes was completely devoid of warmth. It was the look of a corporate executioner observing a man digging his own grave. Unemployed Kendrick repeated the word rolling off his tongue with icy precision. His gaze flicked over Desmond's rented suit, assessing and dismissing my father's entire existence in a single second. "Ms. Washington is not unemployed. She just bought our entire media conglomerate in a hostile cash takeover 48 hours ago. She is my boss. She owns the agency, the building, the subsidiary networks, and every single contract associated with our name." The revelation struck the VIP table like a physical shockwave. Julian's old money parents physically recoiled, their chairs scraping loudly against the polished floor as they leaned away from Desmond. The mother stared at me, her eyes wide with a sudden, terrified respect. She had just witnessed the woman she thought was a penniless outcast, revealed as the apex predator of the Atlanta corporate world. Desmond's jaw went slack. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His mouth opened and closed repeatedly, but no sound emerged. The reality of his colossal mistake was paralyzing his vocal cords. He had just publicly humiliated the most powerful woman in the room, a woman who now held his golden child's entire career in the palm of her hand. Kendrick did not wait for my father to recover. He pivoted smoothly, directing his lethal attention toward the head table. Tiara sat frozen in her towering bridal throne. The smug, victorious smirk she had worn just moments ago was entirely gone, replaced by a mask of sheer, unadulterated terror. Her hands gripped the edges of the table so tightly her knuckles had turned completely white. The soft jazz music played on a bizarrely cheerful accompaniment to the destruction about to unfold, and Tiara Kendrick's voice cut through the vast ballroom, amplified by the sheer force of his authority. Every guest in the room turned their attention to the trembling bride. "You are fired. Effective immediately." The word hit the room like a gunshot. Tiara let out a strangled, breathless gasp. She tried to stand up, the heavy layers of her custom silk gown tangling around her legs, pulling her back down into her chair. "Fired!" Tiara choked out her voice, a high, panicked squeak. "You cannot do this today. This is my wedding. You cannot fire me." "I can, and I just did." Kendrick responded, his tone devoid of any sympathy. "Security has already cleared out your corner office. Your corporate accounts have been frozen and your access badges have been deactivated." Tiara's eyes darted frantically around the room, searching for someone to intervene. She looked at Julian, but the groom was staring at Kendrick in absolute horror. She looked at our mother Valerie, who had just rushed over to Desmond's side, her face twisted in a silent scream of panic. Finally, Tiara looked at me. She expected me to stop this. She expected the older sister she had abused and mocked to suddenly shield her from the consequences of her own actions. I simply took another slow sip of my champagne, my expression entirely unreadable. Kendrick took one step closer to the head table, raising his voice so that even the guests in the very back of the ballroom could hear the charges. "We conducted a full forensic audit prior to the acquisition," he announced, delivering the final fatal blow. "We found the offshore accounts. We found the manipulated vendor invoices. We know exactly where the missing money went. You are being terminated for embezzling $200,000 of company funds to pay for this exact wedding." The ballroom erupted. The sound was deafening, a tidal wave of gasps, shocked whispers, and urgent, overlapping conversations. Socialites covered their mouths, their eyes darting between the disgraced bride and the woman who had just orchestrated her public destruction. Julian's parents stood up simultaneously, their faces burning with the ultimate high society humiliation. They had just been publicly tied to a bride who funded her wedding with stolen corporate money. Tiara burst into frantic, ugly tears. The perfectly applied bridal makeup began to run down her cheeks in dark, muddy streaks. She slammed her hands against the table, knocking over a crystal vase of white orchids. Water spilled across the pristine white tablecloth, ruining the flawless aesthetic she had stolen money to create. "It is a lie!" Tiara screamed, her voice cracking hysterically over the rising noise of the crowd. "She is making this up. Simone is just jealous of me. She has always been jealous of me. She bought the company just to ruin my life." Her desperate cries echoed off the crystal chandeliers, but no one believed her. The damage was done. The elite crowd of Atlanta, the very people Tiara had spent her entire adult life trying to impress and infiltrate, were now looking at her with absolute disgust. She was no longer the beautiful, successful bride of a wealthy heir. She was a common thief caught red-handed in front of her new in-laws. Desmond finally found his voice. He lunged forward, grabbing Kendrick by the arm. "You cannot say these things," he shouted, his desperation making him reckless. "You are ruining her reputation. You will face a defamation lawsuit for this. I will sue you for every penny you have." Kendrick calmly but forcefully removed my father's hand from his suit jacket. "You cannot sue for defamation when the statements are factual, Desmond. We have the bank transfers. We have the altered IP addresses. Your daughter is a criminal. The only reason she is not leaving this hotel in handcuffs right now is because Ms. Washington requested that we handle the termination privately before notifying the authorities." The crowd murmured in agreement. I had shown mercy by not having the police arrest her at the altar, but the public exposure of her crimes in front of this specific audience was a far more devastating punishment than any jail cell. In the ruthless hierarchy of Atlanta's elite, reputation was everything, and Tiara's reputation had just been publicly, permanently eradicated. I stood perfectly still amidst the swirling chaos. I did not gloat. I did not taunt them. I did not need to lower myself to their level of emotional hysteria. The execution of my plan was flawless. The balance of power in my family had officially and irreversibly shifted. I placed my empty champagne flute on a passing waiter's tray. I turned my gaze slowly from the sobbing, ruined bride at the head table to my father, who was currently trembling with a mixture of terror and impotent rage. He looked at me, realizing the monumental scale of his miscalculation. He had tried to crush me to assert his dominance by introducing me as a useless burden. Instead, he had unknowingly handed me the perfect stage to demonstrate my absolute supremacy. "Enjoy the lobster, father," I said quietly. My voice was a low, dangerous murmur that cut through the noise of the panicking crowd. "I hear it tastes much better when you do not have to steal to pay for it." Without another word, I turned my back on the VIP table. The crowd parted for me instantly, stepping aside with a new, terrified reverence as I walked slowly and deliberately toward the grand exit of the ballroom. The sounds of Tiara's hysterical sobbing and Desmond's frantic, failing attempts to appease Julian's disgusted parents faded behind me. The trap had been sprung. The first phase of my retaliation was complete. I had barely taken 5 steps toward the exit when the sharp, violent sound of shattering crystal echoed through the silent ballroom. I paused, turning my head just enough to look back at the head table. The trap had indeed been sprung, but the secondary explosions were only just beginning to detonate. Julian, the perfect groom, the scion of Atlanta's elite, the man my parents had practically worshipped since Tiara first brought him to our family home, had lost his mind. He had stood frozen at the head table during Kendrick's execution of Tiara's career, his handsome features locked in a mask of total confusion. But the shock had finally worn off, replaced by an entirely different, much darker emotion. He had slammed his expensive gold-rimmed champagne flute directly onto the polished marble floor. Shards of sparkling glass exploded outward, raining down on Tiara's custom silk train and scattering across the pristine white dance floor. He did not kneel to help his new wife brush the glass from her lap. He did not pull his sobbing bride into his arms to shield her from the judging, staring eyes of his high society peers. The polished Ivy League veneer he had worn so flawlessly for years evaporated in an instant. His handsome face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The poised, wealthy gentleman completely vanished, revealing a desperate, cornered animal hiding beneath a tailored tuxedo. Julian lunged at her. His hands, which had delicately slid a diamond wedding band onto her finger just a few hours ago now, clamped down hard on her bare upper arm. His grip was rough and punishing. Tiara shrieked a high-pitched sound of genuine fear, startled by the sudden physical aggression from her new husband. Fired, Julian spat the word tearing from his throat like a curse. His voice was raw, loud enough for the first 5 rows of tables to hear perfectly. Are you kidding me right now, Tiara? Fired. Tiara sobbed harder, trying frantically to pull her arm away from his bruising grip. Julian, please, you are hurting me, she cried, her perfectly applied bridal makeup running down her face in dark, muddy streaks. Let go of me. My father will fix this. We can just use your trust fund to pay the agency back. We will pay Kendrick back tomorrow. My trust fund? Julian laughed. It was a manic, hysterical sound that sent a brand new wave of shock rippling through the wealthy crowd. There is no trust fund, Tiara. Are you completely stupid? It is gone. I drained it 2 years ago. Tiara stopped crying for a fraction of a second. Her tear-streaked face registered a brand new kind of terror completely separate from the fear of losing her job. She stared at the man currently digging his fingers into her arm. What do you mean it is gone? She gasped, her voice trembling. You are a Thornton. You are old money. Your family owns half of Buckhead. I am broke, Julian roared, leaning so close to her face that she physically flinched backward in her chair. I am absolutely drowning, Tiara. How are we supposed to pay off my bookie now? You promised me this promotion of yours was a sure thing. You promised me a massive salary bump and a 6-figure bonus right after the wedding. They are going to break my legs, Tiara. Do you understand me? They are coming for my blood. The collective gasp from the room was even louder this time. The illusion of Julian's perfect wealthy background shattered right alongside Tiara's innocent bride persona. The beautiful wealthy power couple was a complete fraud. Julian's parents, seated just feet away at the VIP table, looked as though they had been physically struck by an invisible vehicle. His father clutched his chest, his face turning an alarming shade of purple, while his mother hid her face in her hands, moaning in abject, profound humiliation. Their son, the heir to their prestigious, carefully guarded name, was publicly confessing to severe underground gambling debts in a room full of their investors' country club friends and ruthless business rivals. He was admitting to marrying a woman solely to use her future corporate earnings to pay off the mob. Tiara stared at the man she had just vowed to spend the rest of her life with. The horrifying realization washed over her features in real time. She had embezzled $200,000, ruined her entire career, and committed multiple felonies to marry a man who was using her as a human shield against violent loan sharks. The perfect marriage, the ultimate social triumph my parents had engineered and funded with stolen money, was a mutually assured destruction. They were 2 frauds who had successfully conned each other, and now the massive bill was due. I watched the scene unfold with clinical, detached fascination. It was a masterclass in poetic justice. Every single lie they had told to elevate themselves was being violently dismantled in front of the exact audience they cared about most. But the performance was not quite over. From the corner of my eye, I saw a blur of emerald green and gold motion. Valerie, my mother, was sprinting across the perimeter of the dance floor. She had bypassed her sobbing, ruined youngest daughter entirely. She completely ignored her violent, mob-indebted new son-in-law who was currently shaking his bride by the arm. Her target was not the crisis at the head table. Her target was me. Valerie charged with the frantic, unhinged energy of a woman whose entire universe was collapsing in on itself. Her expensive silk dress flowed behind her as she closed the distance between us. Before my private security detail could step out of the shadows to intercept her, she threw herself at me. Her hands closed like steel vices around my bare shoulders. Her perfectly manicured, acrylic nails dug sharply into my skin, her grip bruising and entirely desperate. "You are the boss!" Valerie screamed, her face mere inches from mine. Her eyes were wide, bloodshot, and completely wild. "You own the company," I heard him say it. I heard Kendrick say it. "Order him to rehire your sister right now." I stared down at the woman who had birthed me. The woman who had spent 32 years telling me I was second best, that I was difficult, that I was a massive disappointment to the family name. She was shaking uncontrollably, her breath ragged and smelling of expensive wine, demanding that I fix a mess I had purposefully orchestrated to trap them. "Do you hear me, Simone?" Valerie shrieked, trying to physically shake me by the shoulders, though I remained firmly planted on the marble floor. "Fix this immediately. Tell that man it was a misunderstanding. Tell him the accounting software made an error. Give Tiara her job back. Give her a raise so she can pay off Julian's debts. Are you trying to destroy this family?" The sheer audacity of her demand was breathtaking. It was a perfect encapsulation of my entire childhood. Even now, standing in the literal wreckage of Tiara's corporate felonies and Julian's criminal financial ruin, Valerie's only instinct was to protect the golden child. Her only reflex was to demand that the scapegoat sacrifice herself to make the golden child's problems disappear. She expected me to wield my newly revealed massive corporate power not to protect my own assets, but to cover up Tiara's blatant embezzlement. She expected me to take the fall for a thief. I did not shout. I did not match her frantic, pathetic energy. I did not try to explain the legal impossibility of rehiring a woman who had just stolen $250,000 from my subsidiary. Explanations were for people who cared about reaching an understanding. I was far past caring. I simply reached up and clamped my hands over her wrists. I squeezed, applying just enough precise, painful pressure to the delicate bones of her wrists to force her fingers to immediately uncurl from my shoulders. Valerie gasped sharply, her eyes widening in shock as I physically removed her hands from my body. I pushed her arms down and took one single dominant step forward, forcing her to stumble backward to maintain her balance. I smoothed the fabric of my gown where her desperate hands had wrinkled it. My movements were slow, entirely deliberate, and completely unfazed. I looked at Valerie, taking in her ruined makeup, her trembling hands, and the absolute bottomless panic consuming her soul. She looked at me, waiting for a lifeline, waiting for the obedient daughter to finally step up and serve the family. "The courts will deal with the thief, Valerie," I said. My voice was a lethal, icy whisper that carried absolute terrifying finality. It was not a threat. It was a legal promise. I used her first name, officially stripping away the title of mother, permanently severing the last microscopic thread of familial loyalty that tied me to her. Valerie let out a broken, wheezing sob. She took another unsteady step backward, as if I had physically struck her across the face. She looked at me not as her daughter, but as an executioner who had just dropped the blade. And looking into my cold, unblinking eyes, she knew I was entirely correct. There would be no mercy. There would be no family discount on justice. I turned my back on her without another word. I turned my back on the hysterical bride weeping at the head table. I turned my back on the violent broke groom who was currently being pulled away from his wife by hotel security. I turned my back on the humiliated, sobbing in-laws and the entire ballroom of gaping, whispering elites who were busy pulling out their phones to document the greatest high society scandal of the decade. I walked purposefully toward the grand double doors of the Four Seasons ballroom. The heavy oak doors swung shut behind me, with a solid, satisfying thud, instantly muting the sounds of my family's total, spectacular annihilation. The heavy oak doors of the Four Seasons closed, severing the hysterical symphony of my family's collapse. The sound of Tiara weeping and Valerie screaming vanished, replaced by the hushed elegance of the hotel lobby. I walked across the imported marble floors, my heels clicking in a steady, measured rhythm that echoed through the quiet space. The air inside the lobby was cool and sterile, scented with a subtle lavender fragrance that helped clear the stifling, desperate atmosphere of the ballroom from my lungs. Every guest I passed stepped out of my way, their eyes wide, having already heard the whispers spilling out from the reception. I did not acknowledge them. I approached the massive glass revolving doors and stepped out into the humid, warm embrace of the Atlanta night. The transition from the artificial chill of the hotel to the thick southern evening air felt like crossing the threshold between two different worlds. The valet stand was quiet, staffed by two young men in crisp, dark uniforms who stood at attention as I approached. I reached into my clutch, retrieving the small, thick cardstock ticket, and handed it to the nearest attendant. He nodded respectfully, his eyes immediately recognizing the VIP indicator printed on the top corner, and signaled for his colleague to retrieve my vehicle. It was a custom black Maybach, a silent armored fortress that represented the quiet, untouchable power I had spent my entire adult life accumulating far away from my parents' judgmental eyes. I stood under the glowing golden canopy of the hotel entrance, breathing deeply, letting the adrenaline of the public execution metabolize into pure cold satisfaction. The distant roar of city traffic felt like a welcoming hum. I was entirely ready to return to my sanctuary, pour a glass of aged whiskey, and read the preliminary fallout reports my executive team was undoubtedly compiling. I wanted to see the exact numbers behind Tierra's corporate theft, but the Washington family dynamic was a parasite that refused to detach quietly. A violent, rattling crash of the hotel's heavy glass doors shattered the tranquil night. I did not turn around immediately. I recognized the heavy, uneven footfalls slapping against the pavement. Desmond was sprinting. The man who had spent the last 20 years cultivating an image of detached, aristocratic superiority was now running across the hotel driveway like a cornered street criminal. Simone, he roared, his voice cracking with an ugly mixture of breathlessness and absolute rage. "Stop right there. Do not take another step." I turned slowly, my expression completely neutral as he closed the distance between us. He was a disastrous sight. His rented tuxedo jacket was unbuttoned and crooked, hanging off his shoulders. The silk bow tie hung loose around his neck, undone by his own panicked hands. Sweat beaded profusely on his forehead, catching the yellow light of the valet canopy and making his skin look terribly pale. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as he threw himself between my body and the curb, physically blocking my path to where the valet was carefully pulling up the Maybach. "You are not walking away from this," he snarled, his face twisted into an ugly, desperate mask. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my face. "You are going to march right back inside that ballroom, get on your phone and fix what you just broke. You are going to order Kendrick to retract those lies, and you are going to write a check to Julian's family to handle whatever ridiculous debt he has gotten himself into. You are the one with the money now. You owe this to us. You owe this to your sister." I looked at the man who had publicly degraded me less than 30 minutes ago, marveling at the profound depth of his delusion. He truly believed he still held authority over me. He genuinely thought he could command the CEO of a media empire just as easily as he commanded the scapegoat child of his household. "I owe you absolutely nothing, Desmond," I stated, my voice barely above a whisper yet carrying the sharp edge of a razor. "Your favorite daughter is a corporate embezzler. Your hand-picked son-in-law is a degenerate gambler targeted by the mob. Your obsessive social climbing has resulted in a public execution. You brought this entirely upon yourselves by choosing appearances over reality. Step aside." The valet put the Maybach in park, leaving the engine running in a silent, powerful purr, and stepped out to open the rear door. I moved to walk past my father, dismissing him completely. But Desmond slammed his hands flat against the polished black door of the vehicle, violently pushing it shut just as the valet attempted to pull the handle. The heavy metal slammed shut with a sickening thud. The young attendant took a startled step back, his eyes wide, sensing the explosive, unpredictable violence radiating from the older man. Desmond pressed his back against the car door, his eyes wild, realizing that parental authority and verbal intimidation had completely failed. He was losing control, and a controlling man backed into a corner is a dangerous thing. He had to use the nuclear option. He had to deploy the single devastating secret he had been hoarding, the ultimate leverage he believed would break my spine and force me to submit. "You think you are untouchable?" Desmond sneered, spit flying from his lips as he leaned in close. "You think because you hid your little corporate empire from us that you hold all the cards. You think you can just burn your family to the ground and drive away in your expensive car. But you do not hold all the cards. If Tierra goes to prison, you lose your grandmother's house." I stopped moving. The air between us seemed to freeze solid. The house he was referring to was a sprawling historic estate on the edge of the city. It had been passed down from my late grandmother directly to me. It was the only place from my childhood that held any genuine warmth, the only piece of property I cherished purely for its sentimental value, not its financial yield. It was my sanctuary before I built my own empire. Desmond saw the microscopic shift in my posture, the slight narrowing of my eyes, and pounced. His face lit up with a sick, triumphant glee. He genuinely believed he had just delivered the killing blow. "That is right," he continued, his voice dropping into a malicious, gloating hiss. "I forged your signature on the deed. I forged your signature, and I mortgaged the entire estate to the bank to pay for this wedding. You let her go down, the bank takes your house. Do you understand what that means, Simone?" I went to a lender who did not ask too many questions. "The loan is tied directly to your name and secured by your property, but the monthly payments are linked to Tiara's corporate salary account. You let her go down for embezzlement. Her income vanishes instantly. The payments default. The bank takes your house. You let your sister go to prison, and you lose the only thing in this world you actually care about. Checkmate, little girl." He stared at me, his chest puffing out, completely intoxicated by his own perceived brilliance. He expected my knees to buckle. He expected me to gasp, to break down into tears of absolute panic, to finally revert to the helpless, submissive daughter he could easily manipulate. He expected me to pull out my checkbook right there on the sidewalk and surrender my corporate power to save my beloved grandmother's legacy. He waited for the terror to consume my face. He waited for the frantic bargaining to begin. Instead, a profound, eerie silence settled over me. I processed the legal and financial implications of his confession in a fraction of a second. Real estate forgery, bank fraud, identity theft, conspiracy to commit wire fraud. These were federal offenses carrying mandatory minimum sentences. He had not just trapped Tiara in her own crimes. He had willingly documented and executed a massive, multi-count felony against his own daughter to fund a party to impress people who did not care about him. I did not cry. I did not scream. I did not show a single ounce of the panic he was so desperately waiting to feed upon. The temperature in my eyes dropped below freezing. The physical stance of my body shifted, shedding the polite, guarded posture of a corporate executive. I looked at the sweating, desperate man blocking my car door. I no longer saw a father. I did not even see an adversary. I saw prey. I saw an aging, careless animal that had just willingly walked into a steel trap and handed me the key. A slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of humanity, a pure reflection of the absolute, calculated destruction I was about to unleash. I reached into my clutch, my fingers wrapping around the smooth metal of my car key. I pressed the button. The Maybach chirped twice, unlocking the doors with a heavy mechanical click that sounded like a vault slamming shut. I stepped directly into Desmond's personal space, forcing him to press his back harder against the tinted glass of the car window. "You forged my signature on a federal bank document," I whispered, my voice dripping with cold, predatory satisfaction. "You actually put your financial crimes in writing." Desmond's triumphant grin faltered, melting into a look of sudden, horrific realization as he stared into the dead, unblinking eyes of his eldest daughter. He had expected to see fear. Instead, he saw his own impending doom. I did not break eye contact. I did not blink. I simply reached into my black velvet clutch and retrieved my phone. My movements were fluid and entirely unbothered, contrasting sharply with the erratic, sweaty panic vibrating off the man pinned against my car. Desmond watched my hands, his breathing shallow and rapid. He was waiting for me to call the bank. He was waiting for me to call Kendrick and beg for Tiara's job back so the mortgage payments could continue. He was waiting for my absolute surrender. Instead, I tapped a single button on my screen and activated the speakerphone. I held the device in the palm of my hand, keeping it suspended in the humid night air between us. The line rang exactly once. "Sterling here, Ms. Washington," a crisp, aggressively alert voice answered. It was Arthur Sterling, the managing partner of the most ruthless elite corporate litigation firm in Atlanta. I kept him on a massive 7-figure retainer for situations exactly like this. His tone carried the lethal efficiency of a man who destroyed corporate empires before his morning coffee. "Arthur," he said smoothly, keeping my eyes locked on my father's crumbling face. "Execute Protocol 4. There was a fraction of a second of silence on the line, just long enough for Sterling to register the magnitude of the command. Protocol 4 was the nuclear option. It was a pre-authorized legal and financial scorched earth campaign designed to annihilate hostile entities. Understood. Sterling replied, his fingers audibly flying across a keyboard in the background. Initiating total financial lockdown. Desmond's jaw slackened. The smug, victorious sneer that had defined his entire existence began to slide off his face, replaced by a terrible, creeping confusion. He did not understand the terminology, but he recognized the tone. It was the sound of apex predators coordinating a kill. Freeze every asset tied to the Washington name, I instructed. My voice was calm, conversational, entirely devoid of the emotional hysteria Desmond had expected. I delivered the instruction as if I were ordering a cup of coffee. Consider it done, Sterling confirmed instantly. We are locking all known accounts, safe deposit boxes, and investment portfolios holding the Washington surname. I am dispatching the injunctions to the financial institutions immediately. Anyone attempting to withdraw, transfer, or liquidate capital will trigger a hard freeze. Their accounts will read 0 by midnight. Desmond's knees physically buckled. He caught himself against the reinforced door of my Maybach, his polished shoes slipping on the concrete. His mouth opened, but only a dry, raspy wheeze escaped. The reality of my words was slamming into him with the force of a freight train. He had threatened the home of my deceased grandmother, thinking it was my single weak point. He had failed to realize that I had spent the last 10 years building an impenetrable fortress around myself. He had handed me the absolute perfect justification to eradicate his entire financial existence. Contact the DA's office. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy Atlanta humidity. And file a police report for real estate forgery against Desmond Washington. Sterling did not miss a beat. I am contacting the head of the white-collar crime division right now. I will have a forensic accounting team at the lending bank the second they open their doors on Monday morning. We will secure the original forged documents, the loan origination signatures, and the electronic transfer records showing the funds being diverted to pay for the wedding vendors. He will be facing federal bank fraud charges alongside the state forgery counts. Shall I alert the federal authorities regarding the wire fraud? Yes, I said. Send them everything. Simone, no. Desmond choked out. It was the first time in 32 years I had ever heard my father plead. It was a pathetic, broken sound. He lunged forward, his hands reaching blindly for the phone, reaching for the connection that was currently sealing his fate. He expected me to pull away, to shrink back from his sudden movement. I did not flinch. I did not move a single inch. I simply stared at him, my expression hardening into a mask of pure, unadulterated dominance. I looked at my father not as a daughter, but as a predator looking at prey. I looked at him the way a hawk looks at a dying mouse in the tall grass. Do not touch me, Desmond, I warned. The command was delivered in a whisper, but it possessed enough lethal authority to stop him dead in his tracks. His hands froze in midair, trembling violently. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The streetlights above the valet stand illuminated the sheer terror pooling in his eyes. He realized in real time that his useless daughter, the child he had mocked, belittled, and introduced to Atlanta high society as an unemployed embarrassment, had the most ruthless legal team in the state on speed dial. He realized that I had not just anticipated his betrayal, but I had actively planned for it. I had been waiting for him to overplay his hand. Simone, please? He begged, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a frantic, pathetic rush. You cannot do this. I am your father. We can fix this. I will sell my cars. I will empty my retirement accounts. I will pay the mortgage back. Just call off the lawyers. If you call the DA, I will go to prison. I will die in prison, Simone. You cannot send your own father to a federal penitentiary. I tilted my head slightly, studying his panicked, sweating face with clinical detachment. You forged my signature to steal the only home I ever felt safe in, I replied, my voice completely flat. You did it to throw $1 million party for a daughter who stole from my company. You walked out here expecting me to weep and surrender. You believed you held the power. You are not my father. You are simply a liability, and I eliminate liabilities. I brought the phone back to my mouth. Keep me updated, Arthur. I want the arrest warrants expedited. We are on it, Ms. Washington. Have a pleasant evening. The line clicked dead. The silence that rushed in to fill the void was deafening. The distant sounds of the city traffic and the muffled bass of the jazz band inside the hotel seemed to fade away completely. There was only the sound of Desmond's ragged, panicked breathing. He stared at me, his eyes wide and vacant. His mind was struggling to process the absolute instantaneous destruction of his life. In less than 2 minutes, he had lost his money, his reputation, and his freedom. He was a ruined man standing in a rented tuxedo, realizing he had just orchestrated his own total annihilation. I turned to the young valet attendant. He was standing perfectly still, his eyes wide as saucers, having witnessed the entire brutal exchange. He was clutching the handle of the Maybach's rear door, frozen in place. "The door, please," I requested softly. The valet jumped startled back into action. "Yes, ma'am. Right away, ma'am." He pulled the heavy armored door open wide, bowing his head respectfully as I approached the vehicle. I did not look back at Desmond. I did not offer him a final gloating speech. I did not need to. The execution was complete. The absolute devastation of his reality was punishment enough. I slid into the cavernous, immaculate rear cabin of the Maybach. The interior smelled of rich, fresh leather and quiet luxury. The ambient lighting glowed in a soft, soothing blue, a stark contrast to the harsh yellow lights of the valet stand. I settled into the plush seat, smoothing the silk skirt of my gown over my knees. The valet closed the heavy door with a solid, definitive thud, sealing me inside my fortress. The thick acoustic glass instantly muted the outside world. "Take me home, Marcus." I instructed my private driver, catching his eyes in the rearview mirror. "Yes, Ms. Washington," Marcus replied smoothly. He shifted the vehicle into gear. The Maybach glided forward, pulling away from the curb with silent, effortless power. I turned my head slightly, looking out the tinted window as we rolled past the entrance of the Four Seasons. Desmond was still standing exactly where I had left him. He looked small, broken, and entirely pathetic. His shoulders were slumped forward, his rented jacket hanging loosely on his frame. He was staring blankly at the spot where my car had just been, his hands hanging limply at his sides. The reality of his impending arrest was crashing down on him, burying him under the weight of his own colossal arrogance. He was completely alone in the parking lot. His golden child was ruined. His wealthy son-in-law was a fraud. His assets were frozen. His freedom was gone. I turned my gaze away from the window, sinking deeper into the soft leather seat. I reached for the chilled bottle of sparkling water resting in the center console. I twisted the cap off the sharp hiss of escaping carbonation breaking the quiet hum of the engine. I took a slow, refreshing sip, letting the cool liquid wash away the lingering tension of the evening. The trap had been flawless. The execution had been perfect. The Washington family name and institution, built entirely on lies, manipulation, and cruelty, had finally been eradicated. I had burned their empire to the ground, not with fire, but with the cold, absolute precision of the law. I watched the city lights blur past the window, a wash of vibrant colors cutting through the dark Atlanta night. The war was officially over. I had won, and I was going home. 2 days had passed since the Four Seasons ballroom became the graveyard of the Washington family's false empire. The financial ripples of my hostile corporate takeover were still dominating the morning business broadcasts across Atlanta. The media called it a masterstroke of predatory capitalism. I simply called it Phase 1. I sat behind the massive slab of polished black obsidian that served as my desk on the penthouse floor of my venture capital firm. The floor-to-ceiling windows behind me offered a panoramic, commanding view of the city skyline, a city I now held firmly in the palm of my hand. The office was a sanctuary of silent power, soundproofed and strictly controlled. I was currently reviewing the preliminary asset forfeiture reports regarding Desmond's forged mortgage when the heavy frosted glass door to my corner office violently swung open. It was not my executive assistant, it was Julian. The man who barged into my pristine workspace looked absolutely nothing like the polished, arrogant heir who had stood at the altar just 48 hours ago. The pristine tailored tuxedo and the smug old money confidence had completely vanished. He had been replaced by a wrinkled, sweat-stained shell of a human being. He was wearing a rumpled button-down shirt that was missing the top two buttons. His normally flawless, expensive haircut was a disheveled, greasy mess. He was breathing heavily, his chest heaving as his bloodshot eyes darted around the immaculate office with the frantic, jerky movements of a hunted animal. He had somehow bypassed the lobby security downstairs, slipping past the biometric badge scanners with the lingering, dying privilege of a recognizable face. But that privilege was rapidly expiring. "Simone," he gasped, slamming the heavy glass door shut behind him. He reached up and clumsily locked the deadbolt. His hands shaking so violently, he barely managed to turn the latch. I did not flinch. I did not reach for the silent panic button concealed beneath the rim of my obsidian desk. I did not even raise my voice. I simply closed the financial dossier I was reading, perfectly aligned the edges of the folder, and folded my hands together on the cool surface of the desk. "You have exactly 30 seconds to explain how you bypassed my private security detail before I have you arrested for criminal trespassing, Julian," I stated calmly, my voice cutting through the silent room like a scalpel. Julian pushed himself off the glass door and staggered toward the center of the office. He moved with a pronounced limp, dragging his left leg slightly. As he stepped into the bright, natural light pouring in from the windows, I noticed a dark, ugly purple bruise blooming across his left cheekbone. The skin around his eye was swollen shut. The violent loan sharks he owed money to were clearly entirely done waiting for their payment. The physical violence had already begun. "I do not have time for your corporate ice queen routine," Julian snarled, his voice cracking with a mixture of rage and sheer suffocating desperation. He reached a trembling hand into the pocket of his slacks and pulled out a small silver object. He hurled it across the room. The small USB flash drive hit my desk with a sharp clack, skittering across the smooth obsidian surface before coming to a complete stop just inches from my folded hands. "I want $500,000, Julian demanded. He lunged forward, slamming both of his sweaty palms flat onto my desk and leaning his bruised face toward mine. "I want $500,000 in untraceable cash, and I want the money wired to an offshore account by noon today. If you do not pay me exactly what I am asking for, I leak this audio." I looked down at the cheap, silver piece of plastic and then slowly raised my eyes back up to meet his bloodshot, terrified gaze. "You are breaking into a highly secured commercial building and attempting to extort a venture capital CEO for $500,000 using a $10 flash drive," Julian Fry said, keeping my tone conversational and completely unbothered. "You are severely out of your depth. You need to leave." "Play it," he spat, pointing a shaking finger directly at the drive. "Plug it into your computer right now and play it. You will see exactly how out of my depth I am. You will see that I hold the keys to your entire family's destruction." I remained perfectly still in my leather executive chair. I do not insert unverified, potentially infected hardware into my secure company network. "Tell me exactly what is on the drive or I am calling the police." Julian let out a harsh, bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. He dragged a hand down his sweaty face, smearing a drop of blood from his bruised cheek. "It is an insurance policy," he sneered, a twisted, desperate smirk appearing on his face. "A few months ago, your lovely parents came over to our condo for dinner. They had a little too much wine. They got comfortable. They started bragging about how they funded Tiara's perfect, luxurious lifestyle. I had a digital recorder running in the study. I capture all my business meetings, and I forgot to turn it off. I caught their entire unfiltered conversation." He leaned even closer, his breath reeking of stale coffee, cheap alcohol, and pure fear. "Do you want to know what they said, Simone?" he whispered maliciously. "They admitted to draining your college trust fund." I held my expression completely neutral, betraying absolutely zero emotion, but the words registered with crystal clear precision. "Oh yes," Julian continued, mistaking my absolute silence for shock. "Your grandparents set up a massive trust fund for your education. It was supposed to cover your tuition, your housing, and your startup capital. Your father and your mother drained every single penny of it 12 years ago. They forged the withdrawal authorizations, They took your college money, and they used it to buy Tiara that luxury Mercedes she loves to flaunt. They used your money to put the down payment on her Buckhead condo. They stole your entire future to fund her lavish lifestyle. And I have them on tape laughing about it. Laughing about how stupid you were to believe the bank lost the money in the Great Recession. The puzzle pieces of my past instantly snapped into perfect alignment. The memory of sitting in the kitchen 12 years ago listening to Desmond tearfully explain how the market crash had wiped out my educational trust flooded my mind. I had worked 3 jobs to put myself through university, while Tiara drove a brand new car she claimed was a graduation gift. They had not just favored my sister, they had actively criminally robbed me to elevate her. Julian pulled his phone from his pocket, tapping the screen frantically with his thumbs. He was running on pure adrenaline and the absolute terror of the men waiting for him outside. He needed me to break. He needed me to panic. If you do not wire me $500,000 today, I am sending this audio file to every major tabloid, every news network, and every financial blog in the state. Julian threatened, his voice rising in pitch as he slammed his fist on the desk. I will frame it perfectly. I will expose the great untouchable Simone Washington as a pathetic fraud whose own family robbed her blind. I will drag your pristine venture capital firm right into the middle of a massive, ugly ghetto tabloid scandal. Your elite investors will run for the hills when they see the chaotic criminal trailer park mess attached to your family name. You let me go down, and I drag your precious reputation through the absolute mud. You pay me the $500,000 or I ruin your public image forever. He stopped shouting, panting heavily, his chest rising and falling as he stared at me. He thought he had me entirely cornered. He truly believed that the threat of public embarrassment, the exposure of my parents' ultimate financial betrayal, would force me to open my vault. In his desperate, crumbling mind image was everything. He expected me to pale, to gasp, to reach for my company checkbook to protect my corporate standing. He expected me to negotiate. Instead, I unlocked my desk drawer. I did not yell. I did not argue. I did not show a single ounce of the devastation he had just tried to weaponize against me. I simply looked at the man sweating profusely on the other side of my desk. The dynamic in the room shifted instantly. The temperature plummeted. I looked at my brother-in-law not as a daughter who had just discovered a terrible family betrayal, and not as a victim of a blackmail scheme. I looked at him as an apex predator analyzing a wounded, bleeding animal that had just willingly walked directly into my den. Julian stepped back slightly, his frantic energy hitting the impenetrable wall of my absolute calm. The smirk faded from his bruised face. The realization began to dawn on him that he had fundamentally miscalculated who he was dealing with. He had brought a flash drive to a gunfight. I picked up my phone and unlocked the screen. The trap was ready to snap shut once again. I slid my left hand smoothly beneath the cool, polished edge of the obsidian desk. My index finger located the small recessed button, hidden perfectly out of sight from the guest chairs. I pressed it firmly. A microscopic green indicator light illuminated on the edge of my phone screen, confirming that the high-definition audio and video recording system integrated seamlessly into my office ceiling was now active and capturing every single sound and movement. Julian had just walked into my corporate headquarters, confessed to wiretapping my parents, and attempted to blackmail me with a $10 piece of plastic. I was currently documenting a federal extortion attempt with state-of-the-art surveillance. I tapped a single red icon on my phone screen, sending a silent, pre-drafted emergency alert directly to my ground floor security team. Extortion is a genuinely fascinating choice of strategy, Julian, I said, my voice echoing slightly in the vast, quiet room. You bypass corporate security, confess to possessing illegally obtained audio recordings, and demand $500,000 under the direct threat of media exposure. You are practically begging for a lengthy prison sentence. Julian scoffed, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of my desk. You think I care about a legal threat when the mob is breathing down my neck? You have the money, Simone. Pay me right now or I swear to God I will ruin you. I will send this file to every contact in my phone. You will not be doing any such thing, I replied calmly. The heavy frosted glass doors of my office suddenly swung open with explosive force. 4 massive men dressed in tailored black suits filed into the room with terrifying speed and absolute silence. They were my personal security detail, highly trained former military contractors who were paid exceptionally well to never ask questions. "Remove this man from the building immediately," I commanded, never breaking eye contact with my sweating brother-in-law. "If he resists, break his legs before you throw him onto the pavement." Julian barely had time to turn his head before the 2 lead guards grabbed his arms, twisting them sharply behind his back with practiced brutal efficiency. He yelped in genuine pain, struggling violently against their iron grips, but his frantic thrashing was completely useless against their combined strength. The 3rd guard snatched the silver flash drive off my desk, wiped it down with a gloved hand, and placed it securely in front of me. "Simone, you cannot do this!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking hysterically as the guards lifted him completely off the floor. "I will ruin you. I will tell the press everything about your family. You will be a laughingstock." "Take the service elevator," I instructed the guards, entirely ignoring his frantic, desperate cries. "Do not let him dirty the main lobby on his way out." They dragged him backward out of the office. His panicked threats echoed down the long marble hallway until the heavy glass doors swung shut, plunging my sanctuary back into total, pristine silence. I looked down at the silver flash drive, resting on the black obsidian glass. The opening battle of the morning was over, but the war was about to rapidly escalate into the public arena. The retaliation came precisely 48 hours later, broadcast live in high definition to millions of viewers across the state. I stood in front of the massive flat-screen monitor mounted on my office wall, holding a fresh cup of black coffee. The volume was turned up, filling the room with the overly sympathetic saccharine voice of the host of Atlanta Morning Live, the city's most watched and highly rated daytime television program. The camera cut to the guest sofa. Tiara and Valerie were sitting close together, their hands tightly clasped. Their performance was an absolute masterclass in emotional manipulation. Tiara looked nothing like the arrogant, embezzling corporate director I had terminated at her own wedding reception. She wore a simple, conservative pastel dress that completely hid her usual flashy aesthetic. Her hair was pulled back modestly. Her makeup was expertly applied to make her look pale, exhausted, and deeply traumatized. She dabbed continually at her eyes with a white tissue, her lower lip trembling flawlessly for the cameras. "It was supposed to be the happiest day of my entire life," Tiara sobbed, her voice cracking perfectly. "I had worked so hard for that agency. I poured my heart, my soul, and all my endless hours into my career. And my sister Simone, she bought the entire conglomerate out from under us in total secret. She did it maliciously, just so she could walk into my wedding reception and fire me in front of all my friends, my colleagues, and my new family. She ruined my life out of pure, unadulterated spite." The host leaned forward, his face etched with performative, exaggerated outrage. "That is incredibly cruel and vindictive. Why would your own flesh and blood do something so devastating on your wedding day?" Valerie shifted closer to the microphone, taking her cue with the precision of a seasoned stage actress. My mother looked the part of the heartbroken, exhausted matriarch. Her posture was slumped and her eyes were brimming with heavy manufactured tears. "Simone has always struggled with severe, deep-seated jealousy," Valerie stated, looking directly into the camera lens with a completely straight face. "Tiara is successful, beautiful, and deeply loved by everyone who meets her. Simone has always harbored a bitter, vindictive resentment toward her sister's natural light. We tried so hard to include her, to love her, to make her feel like part of this family, but Simone has always been cold and detached. We never imagined her jealousy would drive her to orchestrate a hostile corporate takeover just to destroy her sister's wedding day. We are terrified of what she might do to us next." Tiara let out a loud, tragic wail, burying her face in Valerie's shoulder and shaking her shoulders for maximum dramatic effect. "She is an absolute monster," Tiara cried, her voice intentionally muffled by Valerie's sweater. "She fired me without any cause. She locked me out of my personal accounts, and she spread horrible, baseless rumors about me to justify her terrible actions. She wants to see me completely broken and destitute." They did not mention the $250,000 Tiara had stolen from the corporate accounts. They did not mention the offshore wire transfers, the frozen bank accounts, or the forged vendor invoices that I had compiled into a federal dossier. They painted a pristine picture of a tyrannical, unhinged billionaire terrorizing her innocent, hardworking family. It was a brilliant, highly coordinated media smear campaign designed specifically to assassinate my character and force me into a desperate defensive position. And the execution was working flawlessly. Even before the television interview segment ended, the fallout began to detonate across my network. My phone lit up with a rapid, blinding succession of urgent notifications. The public backlash was absolutely immediate and incredibly fierce. My public relations team sent a priority red alert to my desktop computer. Social media was completely flooded with viral clips of Tiara weeping on national television. A hashtag bearing my full name alongside the word monster was already trending at #1 across the entire city of Atlanta. The narrative caught fire instantly. The general public loved a villain, and Valerie had just handed them a wealthy, ruthless corporate ice queen to hate with absolute passion. Thousands of comments poured in attacking my character, demanding a total boycott of my subsidiary brands, and calling for my immediate resignation from the venture capital firm. They accused me of abusing my vast wealth, of destroying my innocent family, and of representing the absolute worst kind of predatory corporate greed. The court of public opinion had convened, heard only one heavily manipulated side of the story, and enthusiastically sentenced me to the guillotine. The secondary explosion hit the financial sector within the hour. The stock tickers displaying the market performance of my newly acquired media conglomerate flashed angry red across my secondary monitor. Corporate investors abhorred instability, and a viral public relations nightmare involving the CEO's personal family drama was the exact definition of toxic financial instability. The share prices took a sharp, noticeable dip, bleeding millions of dollars in total valuation in a matter of minutes, as nervous, risk-averse shareholders began pulling their capital to distance themselves from the controversy. Then the red light on my secure desktop console began to flash rapidly. It was the direct, encrypted line from the board of directors. I placed my coffee cup down on the obsidian desk and pressed the receiver button, activating the room's speakers. "Ms. Washington," the voice of Arthur Sterling came through the speaker, entirely devoid of his usual crisp, cold efficiency. He sounded strained, carrying the collective anxiety of a dozen angry, panicking billionaires. "The board is convening an emergency session right now. We have a severe cascading crisis on our hands." "I am currently watching the broadcast, Arthur," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and unbothered. "It is a desperate, pathetic smear campaign orchestrated by criminals trying to save themselves from prison. The market does not care about the truth, Simone. The market cares entirely about perception," Sterling countered sharply, his voice rising in volume. "Our stock is dropping as we speak. Major subsidiary sponsors are calling my office to pause their advertising contracts until this blows over. The board is expressing extreme, unprecedented concern over this public relations nightmare. They are actively questioning your leadership stability. You look like an unhinged, vindictive tyrant on national television, and it is costing us capital." "Let them panic," I stated firmly, refusing to yield a single inch of ground to his anxiety. "Panic is the first response of the weak." "This is not a game," Simone Sterling warned, his voice tight with genuine professional concern. "Your mother and your sister are spinning a masterpiece out there. They have the public eating out of the palms of their hands. If you do not issue a public statement, if you do not step down temporarily to let the heat pass, the board will force a vote of no confidence. They will strip you of your title by the end of the week to save the stock price." "They will do no such thing," I commanded, leaning closer to the microphone on my desk. "You tell the board to hold the line and stay quiet. You tell them that I anticipated this exact predictable response." Tiara and Valerie just made the fatal mistake of putting their faces on live television and committing public documented defamation. They think they are controlling the narrative, but they are just building their own gallows. I picked up the silver flash drive Julian had thrown on my desk. and rolled it slowly between my fingers. I looked up at the ceiling, staring right at the tiny green light of the concealed camera that had recorded Julian's desperate extortion attempt. I had the audio of my parents admitting to stealing my trust fund. I had the video of Julian threatening me. I had the forged mortgage documents. And now I had them lying to millions of viewers on television. "Tell the board to prepare for phase 2, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous lethal register. I am not going to step down. I am going to drop an anvil on their heads. I severed the connection with Arthur Sterling with a sharp jab of my finger. My public relations director immediately flooded my inbox with drafted apology statements, carefully worded concessions, and defensive press releases designed to mitigate the damage. I selected all of them and hit delete. I was not going to play the victim, and I was certainly not going to apologize for a crime I did not commit. A defensive posture implies guilt, and I possessed absolutely none. Instead of shrinking away from the blinding glare of the media spotlight, I chose to step entirely out of it, plunging into the shadows where the real war would be fought. I picked up my encrypted mobile device and dialed a number that did not exist in any public registry. It belonged to Elias Thorne, a former intelligence operative who now ran a boutique private security and espionage firm exclusively for elite corporate clients. Elias did not handle paparazzi or corporate espionage. He handled total annihilation. "Elias, I need your ghost team. I need your ghost," I said the moment the line connected. "Give me the targets, Simone." His deep, gravelly voice replied, entirely devoid of surprise. "Julian Vance." I instructed, pacing the length of my office. "He has a massive gambling problem, and he owes money to a syndicate that is currently rearranging his facial bone structure. Find the underground ring he frequents. I want his ledgers, his markers, his debt markers, and video evidence of his transactions. I want every single illegal bet he placed while claiming to be a legitimate venture capitalist. I also want his offshore bank records tracing the embezzlement funds Tierra transferred to him." "Consider him stripped bare," Elias confirmed. "Who is the second target?" "Desmond Washington," I said, my voice turning to ice. "My legal team is handling the bank subpoenas, but I want your team to pull his digital footprint. I want every deleted email, every hidden text message, and every encrypted phone call between him and the predatory lender he used to forge my grandmother's mortgage. I want undeniable proof of premeditated fraud. You will have a complete dossier on your desk within 48 hours, Elias stated, ending the call. The hunt had officially begun. The next 2 days were a high-speed, adrenaline-fueled montage of absolute calculated destruction. While the local news stations replayed Tierra's weeping face on a continuous loop, my operatives were quietly dismantling the very foundation of her existence. Elias's team moved through the dark criminal underbelly of Atlanta like phantoms. They tracked Julian's movements to a heavily guarded underground poker room, operating out of the back of a meatpacking facility in the industrial district. My operatives did not ask nicely. They utilized a combination of aggressive financial bribery and physical intimidation to bypass the heavily armed door guards. They cornered the syndicate boss running the operation and presented him with a simple, devastating ultimatum. He could either hand over Julian Vance's original handwritten debt ledgers and security footage, or Elias would anonymously tip off the federal authorities about the illegal casino. The syndicate boss chose self-preservation. Within hours, Elias had high-definition surveillance video of Julian snorting cocaine and signing away hundreds of thousands of dollars he did not possess. The ledgers proved Julian owed over $2 million to violent criminals. Simultaneously, Arthur Sterling and my legal battalion launched a relentless surgical strike against the banking institution Desmond had used to secure the fraudulent mortgage. Sterling did not file polite requests. He walked directly into the bank's corporate headquarters, backed by 2 federal marshals holding court-ordered subpoenas. He demanded immediate, unrestricted access to the loan origination files. The bank executives, terrified of being implicated in a massive federal wire fraud conspiracy, completely capitulated. Sterling's forensic accounting team seized the original physical deed to my grandmother's house. They ran immediate handwriting analysis on the signature, comparing it to my official corporate documents. The results were conclusive and legally binding. Desmond's forgery was sloppy, hurried, and entirely undeniable. Sterling did not stop there. He subpoenaed the bank's internal security footage from the day the loan was finalized. He secured clear, time-stamped video of Desmond Washington sitting in the loan officer's cubicle, physically signing my name onto the federal documents. To ensure absolute destruction, Sterling traced the loan disbursement. He pulled the digital wire transfer receipts, proving exactly where the stolen money went. The funds flowed directly from the bank into a catering company, a luxury florist, and a high-end bridal boutique. Desmond had literally left a glowing neon paper trail leading straight from a federal crime to his daughter's wedding reception. While my team gathered the ammunition for a nuclear strike, the Washington family was busy celebrating their perceived victory. Across town, inside the lavish, heavily mortgaged Buckhead condo that Julian and Tiara shared a victory party, was in full swing. My private surveillance team had easily hacked into the building's security feeds and audio monitors, streaming the entire disgusting spectacle directly to my encrypted laptop. I sat in my dark office watching the live feed on my monitor. Tiara was lounging on a massive white leather sectional sofa, wearing a silk robe and holding a crystal flute of expensive champagne. Her face was completely devoid of the tragic weeping mask she had worn for the television cameras. She was glowing with smug, arrogant satisfaction. Valerie sat beside her, laughing loudly as she refreshed the social media feeds on her tablet. "Did you see the comments on the morning show's page?" Valerie cackled, taking a large sip of her wine. "They absolutely hate her, Tiara. They are calling for her to be investigated by the labor board. We completely destroyed her public image. She is probably hiding in her office right now, crying her eyes out." Tiara tossed her head back, letting out a sharp, victorious laugh. She thought she could embarrass me at my own wedding and just get away with it. She thought her money made her a god. Well, look at her now. Her stock is dropping, her board is panicking, and the whole city thinks she is a jealous, bitter spinster. "I told you this would work, Mom. The media loves a victim, and I play a fantastic victim." Julian paced back and forth across the hardwood floor, nervously rubbing his bruised cheek. He was the only one in the room who did not look entirely convinced of their victory. He kept glancing toward the locked front door, jumping at every minor sound in the hallway. He knew the mob was still looking for him, and he was desperately waiting for my $500,000 ransom payment to hit his account. "We need to keep the pressure on," Julian said, his voice tight with anxiety. "Simone is quiet. She has not issued a statement. She has not fired back. That makes me nervous. She is a snake, and snakes hide before they strike. We need to do another interview tomorrow. We need to demand a public apology. We need to force her hand so she pays up." Desmond scoffed from his position by the kitchen counter. He was aggressively slicing a block of imported cheese, looking arrogant and entirely invincible. "Stop panicking, Julian," Desmond ordered, waving the knife dismissively. "Simone is quiet because she is beaten. We backed her into a corner she cannot buy her way out of. I know my daughter. She is obsessed with her corporate reputation. She will wire you that hush money by tomorrow morning to keep the audio recording quiet, and she will quietly give Tiara her job back to stop the bad press. We hold all the cards. We outsmarted her." They raised their glasses, clinking them together in a grotesque celebratory toast. They cheered to their brilliance, to their manipulation, and to my ultimate downfall. They sat in a condo funded by stolen money, drinking champagne bought with fraudulent credit, congratulating themselves on a flawless victory. They were completely, blissfully unaware that they were standing at ground zero. I watched the live feed on my monitor, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen. I did not feel angry. I did not feel sad. I felt a profound, chilling sense of absolute clarity. They had shown me exactly who they were. They had proven beyond any shadow of a doubt that they possessed zero remorse, zero morality, and zero hesitation when it came to destroying my life for their own personal gain. They had forced my hand, and now they were going to suffer the absolute maximum penalty. My office door chimed softly. Elias Thorne walked into the room, followed closely by Arthur Sterling. They did not speak. They simply walked up to my obsidian desk and placed two thick, heavy manila folders directly in front of me. I reached out and opened the first folder. It contained high-resolution photographs of Julian signing gambling markers in the underground club, accompanied by certified copies of his massive outstanding debt ledgers. I opened the second folder. It held the original bank-stamped mortgage deed, with Desmond's forged signature glaring off the page, paired with the time-stamped security photos of him committing the felony. "We have everything," Ms. Washington Sterling said, his voice buzzing with barely contained predatory excitement. "The evidence is bulletproof. The federal authorities are standing by. The local police department has the arrest warrants drafted and ready for a judge's signature. We have Julian's mob connections fully documented, and we have the exact audio file Julian tried to blackmail you with, proving the extortion attempt." Elias nodded grimly. "My team has their condo surrounded. We track their vehicles, their phones, and their physical movements. They cannot run. The perimeter is entirely secured." I closed the folders and rested my hands on top of the smooth cardboard. I looked back at the monitor, watching my family laugh and drink champagne on the live surveillance feed. They were so confident. They were so incredibly foolish. "Are we releasing the evidence to the press first or the police?" Sterling asked, pulling out his mobile device to begin the sequence. "Neither," I replied, my voice dangerously soft. I stood up from my leather chair, picking up the two thick folders of evidence. "If I give this to the police first, they will be arrested quietly in their home. If I give it to the press, they will have time to spin another lie. I do not want them arrested quietly, and I do not want them to have a single second to react. They use the media to conduct a public execution of my character. I am going to return the favor." I walked around the desk, my heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. "Call the producers at Atlanta Morning Live," I instructed Sterling, a cold, ruthless smile spreading across my face. "Tell them I am ready to break my silence. Tell them I am ready to do an exclusive live in-studio interview tomorrow morning to address my family's allegations directly." Sterling's eyes lit up with sudden malicious understanding. He grinned, nodding his head. "A live television ambush, brilliant. I am not just going to drop an anvil on their heads," I said, walking toward the office door. "I am going to drop it on live television in front of the exact same audience they used to smear my name. Have the federal marshals waiting in the green room. We are going to broadcast their destruction to the entire world." The blinking red light on the camera held my gaze for another long second before I shook my head. A slow, terrifying realization washed over me. A sterile television studio was far too impersonal. It was too controlled by producers and network executives. If I was going to execute my family in public, I wanted to do it on my own territory. I wanted to drop the guillotine in front of the exact high society billionaires my parents had spent their entire pathetic lives trying to impress. "Arthur," I said, turning back to my managing partner, "cancel the morning show interview." Sterling blinked, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Ms. Washington, you just said you wanted to broadcast their destruction." "I do," I replied, walking back to my obsidian desk and pressing the intercom button for my executive assistant. "But I want it done on a much grander stage. The annual Washington Foundation Charity Gala is tomorrow night at the Botanical Garden. The guest list already includes every major venture capitalist, banking executive, and media mogul in the Southern Hemisphere. We will invite the press there. We will invite the local news anchors, the financial bloggers, and the tabloid reporters." Elias Thorne crossed his massive arms over his chest, a dark chuckle rumbling in his throat. "You are going to ambush them at a black tie gala. I am going to make them the main event," I confirmed. I instructed my assistant to bring me 4 of the blank reserve VIP invitations. They were heavy, luxurious pieces of cardstock, edged in genuine gold leaf, and sealed in matte black envelopes. They represented the absolute pinnacle of Atlanta high society. For years, Desmond and Valerie had begged for invitations to this specific gala, desperate to rub shoulders with my billionaire colleagues. I had always refused, keeping my professional sanctuary completely uncontaminated by their toxic social climbing. Now I was giving them exactly what they had always wanted. I took a gold ink fountain pen from my desk drawer. I did not ask my assistant to print formal labels. I wanted this to be deeply, terrifyingly personal. I uncapped the pen and pressed the nib against the thick black paper. I wrote out their names with deliberate, flowing precision. Desmond Washington, Valerie Washington, Tiara Vance, Julian Vance. Inside each envelope, I slid the embossed VIP entry pass. But before I sealed them, I took a small piece of matching black stationery. I wrote a single identical sentence for each of them. It was not a plea. It was a perfectly calculated piece of bait designed to trigger their insatiable greed. Come collect a check tonight to clear your debts or lose absolutely everything. I blew softly on the gold ink to dry it, then slid the notes into the envelopes and sealed them with a heavy press of black wax. I handed the 4 envelopes to Elias. Have your ghost team hand deliver these to the Buckhead condo immediately, I instructed. Make sure they are placed directly into Desmond's hands. I want them to have exactly 24 hours to let their arrogance completely blind them to reality. My surveillance feed from the Buckhead condo provided a flawless view of the delivery. Less than an hour later, a man in a crisp delivery uniform knocked on Tiara's front door. Desmond answered, his chest puffed out with arrogant authority. He snatched the black envelopes from the courier without a word of thanks and slammed the door. I watched the live video feed on my monitor as Desmond walked back into the living room, tossing the envelopes onto the glass coffee table. Tiara, Valerie, and Julian gathered around their eyes, lighting up at the sight of the gold leaf embossing. What is this? Valerie asked, her perfectly manicured fingernails tearing into the thick black paper. She pulled out the VIP pass, her jaw dropping. It is Simone's charity gala, the billionaire event. She invited us. Julian practically ripped his envelope open, his trembling, bruised fingers fumbling with the wax seal. He pulled out the handwritten note and read the golden ink aloud. Come collect a check tonight to clear your debts or lose absolutely everything. A heavy, stunned silence fell over the living room. My family stared at the notes, processing the words. I sat in my quiet office watching them through the hidden camera, waiting for the panic to set in. I expected them to realize that I knew about their debts. I expected them to connect the dots and figure out that the phrase, lose absolutely everything, was a literal legal threat. Instead, Julian threw his head back and let out a loud, triumphant roar of laughter. We broke her! Julian shouted, waving the black stationery in the air like a winning lottery ticket. I told you. I absolutely told you. The mob pressure, the television interview, the stock market dipping. We completely broke the Ice Queen. She is waving the white flag. Desmond snatched his own note, his chest puffing out so far he looked like a cartoon caricature of a wealthy patriarch. Of course she is waving the white flag. Desmond sneered, a sickeningly smug grin stretching across his face. She is terrified. She knows her little venture capital firm cannot survive a prolonged media scandal. She knows that if we keep doing television interviews, her investors will pull their money. She is begging for a truce. She wants to hand over the ransom money in person so she can force us to sign non-disclosure agreements. Tiara clapped her hands together, practically bouncing on the balls of her feet. She was already mentally spending the money. She did not feel an ounce of remorse for the corporate theft she had committed, nor did she feel any shame for the brutal, televised lies she had spun about her own sister. She wants to pay us off at her precious gala. Tiara laughed, picking up the VIP pass and fanning herself with it. She wants to buy our silence while simultaneously trying to save face in front of her rich friends. This is perfect. We walk in there, we rub shoulders with the billionaires, we take her pathetic check, and we walk out untouchable. I am going to buy a new Birkin bag tomorrow morning. Valerie walked over to the hallway mirror, admiring her reflection and smoothing her hair. She will probably want us to pose for photos with her. Valerie mused, her voice dripping with venomous satisfaction. To show the press that the family is reunited and the rumors were just a silly misunderstanding. We should make her beg for it. We should double the asking price when we get there. If she is offering to clear our debts, we need to make sure we leave with enough extra to buy a summer home. I sat back in my leather executive chair watching the live feed with a cold, detached fascination. The sheer magnitude of their delusion was breathtaking. They had completely misinterpreted the trap. They read a lethal ultimatum and saw a surrender treaty. Their greed and their obsessive need for social superiority had completely lobotomized their survival instincts. They did not question how I knew the exact extent of their debts. They did not question why I would invite them to a highly publicized event rather than handling a quiet, discreet payoff in a lawyer's office. They only saw the gold ink, the VIP access, and the promise of a massive payout. Julian pulled his phone out, aggressively dialing his tailor. "I need to get my tuxedo pressed," he barked into the receiver, ignoring the massive purple bruise swelling around his eye. "I am attending the Washington Foundation Gala tomorrow night. Yes, VIP access. Have it ready by noon." Desmond poured himself another massive glass of expensive bourbon, holding it up in a mock toast to the ceiling. To my ungrateful, arrogant daughter, Desmond boomed, laughing heartily. "Thank you for finally learning your place in this family. You always were the bank." I reached out and clicked the surveillance feed off. The screen faded to black, plunging my office back into absolute silence. Elias and Arthur Sterling were still standing in front of my desk, having watched the entire exchange over my shoulder. Sterling was shaking his head slowly, a mixture of disgust and professional awe on his face. "They genuinely believe they have won," Sterling murmured, adjusting his silk tie. "I have dealt with hostile corporate raiders, embezzlers, and cartel bosses, but I have never seen a group of people march so happily and blindly toward their own absolute destruction. They are completely oblivious to the fact that you hold their arrest warrants in your desk drawer." "Arrogance is the greatest anesthetic in the world, Arthur," I replied softly, turning my chair to look out at the sprawling Atlanta skyline. "It numbs the brain to reality. They are intoxicated by the idea of defeating me. They are so desperate to be powerful that they cannot see the cage locking around them." Elias stepped forward, his military posture rigid. "My security perimeter at the Botanical Garden is fully established, Ms. Washington. The press corps has confirmed their attendance. The local news vans will be stationed exactly where you requested. We have a private room secured adjacent to the main ballroom for the final confrontation. The federal marshals will be waiting out of sight until you give the signal." "Excellent," I said, standing up and smoothing the front of my tailored suit. "Let them dress up. Let them rent their expensive cars and shine their shoes. Let them walk into that gala feeling like absolute royalty. The higher they climb onto their pedestal tomorrow night, the harder the concrete is going to feel when I smash it to pieces." I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the busy city streets far below. The media smear campaign was still raging online. My name was being dragged through the digital mud by millions of strangers who believed Tierra's weeping performance. My board of directors was sweating over dropping stock prices and nervous investors. The world believed that Simone Washington was bleeding out. I smiled. It was a cold, razor-sharp expression that held absolutely zero warmth. Tomorrow night, the narrative would end. Tomorrow night, the parasite that was the Washington family would be violently publicly severed from my life forever. I had given them the rope, and they had gleefully tied the noose themselves. All that was left to do was kick the chair out from under them. The Atlanta Botanical Garden had been transformed into a fortress of absolute opulence. A massive climate-controlled glass pavilion had been erected over the great lawn, glowing like a diamond against the dark night sky. Valet attendants in crisp white jackets rushed to open the doors of arriving Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, and armored black SUVs. The red carpet leading up to the grand entrance was flanked by a terrifying gauntlet of local and national press. Camera flashes exploded like lightning, capturing the arrival of senators, tech billionaires, and international banking magnates. At precisely 8 o'clock, a rented, oversized white stretch limousine pulled up to the curb. It was a tacky, ostentatious choice that practically screamed new money, completely out of place among the fleet of understated executive town cars. The rear door swung open, and Desmond Washington stepped out, adjusting the lapels of a bespoke velvet tuxedo that cost more than his car. He reached back, offering a hand to Valerie. My mother emerged dripping in rented diamonds, wearing an emerald silk gown that dragged heavily across the red carpet. Tierra and Julian followed closely behind, completing the grotesque parade of stolen luxury. Tierra looked like she was walking a Paris runway. She wore a custom hand-beaded silver gown, with a plunging neckline paired with a massive diamond choker she had purchased that very morning, using a credit card tied to my subsidiary accounts. Julian walked stiffly beside her, wearing a designer tuxedo tailored to hide his nervous sweating. He had applied a heavy layer of theatrical concealer over his left eye to hide the massive purple bruise left by the syndicate enforcers, but the swelling was still slightly visible under the glaring camera flashes. They did not look like a family on the brink of federal indictment. They looked like royalty arriving for their coronation. They paused at the center of the red carpet, throwing their shoulders back and posing aggressively for the paparazzi. Valerie practically shoved another socialite out of the way to ensure the cameras captured her good side. Desmond smiled broadly, waving to reporters he did not know, absolutely convinced he was finally taking his rightful place among the financial elite. Inside the glass pavilion, the scene was breathtaking. Thousands of white orchids cascaded from the ceiling, illuminated by hundreds of floating candles. Waiters moved silently through the crowd, carrying silver trays of caviar and vintage champagne. The room hummed with the quiet, powerful energy of immense wealth. Tierra immediately grabbed 2 glasses of champagne from a passing waiter and scanned the room, her eyes darting greedily over the crowd of billionaires. She spotted her target standing near the center ice sculpture. Julian's parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance. The senior Vances were old Atlanta money conservative, quiet, and deeply suspicious of Tierra's flashy behavior. They had never fully approved of the marriage, and Tierra had spent the last 2 years desperately trying to prove her superiority to them. Tonight, she believed she finally had the ultimate ammunition. Tierra grabbed Julian's arm and dragged him across the ballroom, practically shoving her way through a group of banking executives. Richard Eleanor Tierra practically shouted over the low hum of the string quartet, throwing her arms open in a theatrical display of affection. "I am so glad you could make it to our family event." Eleanor Vance offered a tight, forced smile, her eyes darting critically over Tierra's revealing silver gown. "Good evening, Tierra. We were surprised to receive the VIP invitation, especially considering the unfortunate news coverage we have been seeing all week. We assumed things between you and Simone were highly fractured." Tierra tossed her head back and let out a loud, ringing laugh that caused several nearby guests to turn and stare. "Oh, that silly television interview was just a strategic maneuver," Tierra lied smoothly, taking a large gulp of her champagne. "You know how corporate negotiations go. Simone is incredibly stubborn, and sometimes you have to apply a little public pressure to get her to see reason. But she finally realized her mistake." Tierra leaned in closer, dropping her voice to a conspiratorial stage whisper designed to be overheard by everyone in a 10-foot radius. "She is going to publicly apologize tonight and promote me to vice president of the entire media conglomerate." Tierra bragged, her chest puffing out with absolute arrogance. "She is completely terrified of losing me to a rival firm. That is why she gave us the Ultra VIP passes. She is presenting us with a massive settlement check tonight to officially clear the air. She knows she cannot run the empire without my creative direction." Julian nodded enthusiastically beside her, shifting his weight nervously. "Exactly. Simone is heavily reliant on our guidance. The media drama was just a minor family disagreement. Tonight is about securing our executive contracts." Richard Vance raised a single gray eyebrow, looking entirely unconvinced by the heavily bruised, sweating man standing in front of him. "If she is promoting you, Julian, why do you look like you were hit by a commercial freight train?" Julian touched his concealed eye, his face flushing dark red. "A minor tennis accident at the club," he stammered quickly. "Nothing to worry about. The important thing is that the Vance family is about to see a massive, unprecedented influx of capital. We are moving up to the executive board." Across the ballroom, Desmond and Valerie were holding their own delusion-fueled court. Desmond had cornered Arthur Sterling near the main bar, blissfully unaware that Sterling was the architect of his impending federal destruction. "Arthur, my good man!" Desmond boomed, clapping his heavy hand violently onto Sterling's tailored shoulder. "A spectacular setup you have here." "Simone really knows how to throw a party with my money, does she not?" Sterling did not flinch. He simply offered a cold, razor-thin smile. "It is certainly a night that will go down in history, Mr. Washington. We have spared absolutely no expense for the final presentation." Desmond laughed, taking a fresh glass of bourbon from the bar. "Well, make sure you have the checkbook ready. Simone has finally learned that she cannot bully her own flesh and blood. She thought she could cut us out, but we showed her exactly who controls the narrative in this city. I expect the media apology to be thorough, Arthur. I want her to specifically state that she acted rashly and that the family is back in control of the assets. I am certain Simone's speech will cover every single detail of your financial history, Sterling replied smoothly, turning his body slightly to check the time on his watch. If you will excuse me, I need to ensure the press pool is in position for the keynote address. Enjoy the champagne, Desmond. It will be a very long time before you taste anything like it again. Desmond completely missed the lethal implication. He just nodded arrogantly and turned back to the crowd, grabbing Valerie's hand. Look at them, Valerie whispered, her eyes shining with greedy delight as she surveyed the room of billionaires. They are all looking at us, Desmond. They know we beat her. They know we put the great Simone Washington in her place. We are finally going to be respected in this town. Valerie flagged down a photographer from a major society magazine, practically dragging the poor man over to take their picture. Make sure you get the diamonds in the shot, Valerie instructed, posing with her hand resting elegantly on Desmond's chest. The caption should read, "The Washington family reunited and stronger than ever." The sheer absolute arrogance vibrating off my family was palpable. It radiated from them in toxic, suffocating waves. They strutted through the glass pavilion like conquering warlords who had just successfully invaded a foreign kingdom. They drank the expensive champagne, they ate the imported caviar, and they bragged to anyone who would listen about how they had successfully blackmailed a billionaire into submission. They believed they were untouchable. They believed the black and gold invitations in their pockets were golden tickets to a lifetime of unearned luxury. They thought the reporters were there to document their triumphant return to the top of the corporate food chain. High above the ballroom floor, I stood in the shadowed control booth overlooking the entire pavilion. I wore a tailored midnight black tuxedo suit, my hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving style. I watched Desmond laugh. I watched Tiara brag. I watched Julian sweat through his rented jacket. I watched Valerie adjusting her stolen diamonds. My hands rested flat against the cool metal of the control console. Beside me, Elias Thorne gave a single sharp nod. The federal marshals were in position behind the main stage curtains. The local police units had quietly secured every exit leading out of the botanical garden. The perimeter was entirely locked down. There was absolutely no way out. A gentle melodic chime echoed through the pavilion's massive sound system, signaling the guests to take their seats for the evening's main presentation. The crowd slowly moved toward the front of the room, taking their places at the round, silk-draped tables. The center table, positioned directly in front of the main stage, was marked with a heavy gold placard that read, "Reserved Washington Family VIP." Desmond led the charge, practically shoving past a tech CEO to claim the head seat at the table. Valerie sat beside him, smoothing her emerald gown and waving regally to the surrounding tables. Tiara and Julian took the remaining seats, Tiara proudly placing her designer clutch directly onto the pristine white tablecloth. They were practically vibrating with smug, greedy anticipation. They were sitting front and center, completely ready to receive their public apology and their massive payout. The low hum of polite conversation began to swell as the final guests took their seats. The press corps moved into position at the back of the room, their camera lenses focused directly on the main stage. I picked up the wireless microphone resting on the console. The clock hit exactly 9 o'clock. "Cut the music," I ordered softly into the headset. The string quartet instantly stopped playing. "Drop the house lights." The massive crystal chandeliers hanging above the ballroom floor suddenly went completely black. The room was plunged into total darkness, save for the small, flickering lights of the floating candles. A sudden heavy silence swept through the crowd of billionaires. The tension in the room spiked instantly, crackling through the air like raw electricity. A single, blindingly bright white spotlight snapped on, illuminating the center of the main stage. The war had officially moved into the public arena, and I was about to drop the guillotine. I gripped the microphone, stepped out of the shadows, and walked directly into the blinding light. My family was sitting in the front row, grinning up at me, completely unaware that the floor beneath them had just disappeared. "It is time to begin," I said, my voice echoing like thunder through the massive glass pavilion. And the trap snapped shut. I stepped up to the acrylic podium, adjusting the microphone with deliberate, measured precision. The heavy gold-leafed doors of the grand ballroom had been locked by my private security detail the moment the final guests took their seat. The crystal chandeliers hanging above the sea of Atlanta's most powerful billionaires, politicians, and media moguls dimmed to a low, dramatic glow. The room fell dead silent. It was the kind of suffocating, absolute silence that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Thousands of eyes were locked onto my position, waiting for the corporate surrender, the groveling apology, and the public concessions they had been promised by the relentless media cycle. In the very front row, separated from my podium by a mere 10 feet of polished marble, my family sat, basking in their premature victory. Desmond leaned back in his chair, with his arms crossed over his chest, his rented velvet tuxedo catching the harsh light of the single spotlight. Valerie was practically preening, her chin tilted upward as she waited for me to beg for forgiveness, her fingers tracing the edge of a diamond necklace paid for with stolen funds. Tiara had a sickly sweet, condescending smile plastered across her face, completely ready to accept her public promotion and her massive settlement check. Julian sat rigidly beside her, clutching his crystal champagne flute, like a lifeline, his eyes darting arrogantly toward the press pool at the back of the room. They had bragged to the elite socialites all evening, they had gloated, they had strutted. I did not break eye contact with Tiara as I reached into my jacket pocket. I withdrew a small matte black remote control. I held it up, letting the polished plastic catch the spotlight, and pressed the single button in the center. A heavy mechanical hum vibrated through the floorboards. Behind me, a massive 20-foot-wide projector screen descended silently from the ceiling truss, dropping down to cover the entire back wall of the stage. The dual laser projectors mounted in the lighting rig clicked on simultaneously, casting a brilliant high-definition glow across the ballroom. The sudden illumination washed over the faces of the billionaires sitting at the pristine tables. I leaned forward into the microphone. "Good evening," I said, my voice entirely stripped of emotion, ringing with lethal clarity through the state-of-the-art sound system. "You are all invited here tonight under the pretense of a charitable gala and an anticipated public apology regarding my family. I am here to formally announce that there will be absolutely no apology issued tonight. Instead, we are going to conduct a transparent, public, and legally binding audit of the Washington family." A ripple of confusion swept through the audience. Chairs scraped against the floor. At the VIP table, Desmond's arrogant smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, his brow furrowing as he stared up at me. Tiara shifted uncomfortably, placing her champagne glass down onto the white tablecloth. I pressed the remote again. Slide 1 appeared on the 20-foot screen in blinding, irrefutable detail. It was not a chart or a corporate logo. It was a dense, meticulously compiled paper trail. The screen displayed a split view. On the left were the internal corporate accounting ledgers from my subsidiary media firm. On the right were certified offshore bank statements belonging directly to Tiara Vance. For the past 18 months, my sister Tiara Vance has used her position as corporate director to systematically embezzle $250,000 from company operating funds. I stated, my voice echoing over the growing murmurs of the crowd. I clicked the remote, highlighting specific enlarged sections of the documents in bright red ink. The screen illuminated fraudulent vendor invoices created for non-existent marketing services. Beside them, the corresponding wire transfer receipts showed the exact amounts flowing directly into a shell corporation registered under Tiara's maiden name. I clicked again, and the screen flashed with personal credit card statements. "These stolen funds were not used for business development," I continued mercilessly. "They were used to fund a lavish, fraudulent lifestyle. Here you can clearly see corporate money paying for luxury bridal boutiques, imported floral arrangements, and the very designer gown she is currently wearing in the front row of this ballroom." A collective audible gasp rippled through the elite crowd. Hundreds of heads snapped toward the VIP table. Tiara's face drained of all color. Her mouth dropped open, but no sound came out. The sickly sweet smile completely vanished, replaced by an expression of absolute paralyzing terror. She shrank back into her chair, her hands trembling so violently that the silverware rattled against her plate. Beside her, Julian's parents, Richard and Eleanor Vance, stared up at the massive screen in unadulterated horror. Eleanor placed a hand over her chest, looking at Tiara with an expression of profound disgust. "You are lying!" Valerie shrieked, jumping up from her chair and pointing a manicured finger at the stage. "This is a fabrication. You are just jealous of her." I ignored her completely and pressed the remote. Slide 2 hit the screen like a physical blow. The embezzlement documents vanished, replaced by a massive high-definition scan of a residential mortgage deed. The document was zoomed in perfectly on the signature line. My family recently claimed on national television that I orchestrated a hostile corporate takeover out of sheer vindictiveness, I announced, projecting my voice over Valerie's hysterical shouting. The truth is far more severe. My father, Desmond Washington, utilized predatory lending contacts to forge my signature and take out a fraudulent second mortgage on my late grandmother's estate. I clicked the remote, bringing up the forensic handwriting analysis. A split screen appeared. On the left was my verified legal signature. On the right was the sloppy, hurried forgery from the bank deed. The forensic markers highlighted the massive discrepancies in pen pressure and stroke angle in glowing green ink. The analysis report stamped across the bottom of the screen read "Conclusive forgery." Desmond's face turned an unhealthy ashen gray. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning stark white as he tried to push himself upright. He looked like a man who had just stepped on a landmine and heard the triggering click. "If forensic analysis is not enough to convince the press pool in the back of the room," I said coldly, staring directly into the camera lenses of the local news anchors, "let us look at the bank's internal security footage." The screen switched to a crisp, time-stamped video feed. It showed Desmond Washington sitting in a cramped loan officer's cubicle, physically signing the fraudulent documents. The time and date stamped on the video perfectly matched the origination date of the fraudulent loan. The ballroom erupted into a frenzy of shocked whispers and frantic note-taking. The reporters at the back of the pavilion were practically shoving each other out of the way to get clear photographs of the massive projector screen. The billionaires sitting at the surrounding tables physically leaned away from the Washington family, treating them like they carried a highly contagious disease. Desmond sank back down into his chair, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The bluster and arrogance were completely gone, replaced by the suffocating realization that he had just been exposed committing a federal crime in front of every major banking executive in the state of Georgia. Valerie fell back into her seat, pulling her rented diamonds tightly against her chest. She looked around the room, making eye contact with the wealthy socialites she had spent decades trying to court. They were looking back at her with undisguised contempt. Her entire social standing was disintegrating in real time. "I am not finished," I commanded, silencing the growing uproar with the sharp edge of my voice. I pressed the remote for the third and final time. Slide 3 did not feature financial documents. It was a stark black screen with a single audio waveform pulsing in the center. 48 hours ago, Julian Vance entered my private office. I stated, turning my gaze to my sweating, terrified brother-in-law. He bypassed my corporate security to deliver an illegally obtained audio recording, and he attempted to extort me for $500,000 to pay off his illicit debts. I clicked the play button on the console. Julian's panicked, desperate voice boomed through the massive speakers filling every corner of the Botanical Garden Pavilion. "You think I care about a legal threat when the mob is breathing down my neck?" the recording blared. "You have the money, Simone. Pay me right now, or I swear to God I will ruin you. I will send this file to every contact in my phone." The audio cut off sharply. The silence that followed was heavy and lethal. Julian buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking. He had tried to hide his bruising with makeup, but the sweat pouring down his face was causing the concealer to melt away, revealing the dark, violent reality of his situation. I clicked the remote one final time. The black screen vanished, replaced by clear night vision security footage from the underground casino. It showed Julian sitting at a poker table, frantically signing markers. Beside the video, Elias Thorne's ghost team had uploaded high-resolution scans of Julian's actual gambling ledgers. The total debt figure was highlighted in bright red at the bottom of the screen: $2.4 million owed to an organized criminal syndicate. Richard Vance stood up from the table, his face dark red with absolute unrestrained fury. He looked down at his son, his voice shaking with rage. "You worthless, pathetic fool," Richard spat loud enough for the entire front section to hear. "You brought this filth into our family. You married a thief and you gamble with mobsters. We are completely finished with you." Eleanor Vance grabbed her husband's arm, hiding her face behind her clutch purse as they quickly abandoned the VIP table, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Tiara tried to reach out to her husband, but Julian violently slapped her hand away, paralyzed by his own public destruction. Desmond was staring blankly at the floor, his chest heaving as he struggled to breathe. Valerie was openly sobbing, her mascara running down her cheeks as she realized that she would never ever be welcomed in polite society again. I stood at the podium looking down at the absolute wreckage of my family. They had demanded a public arena. They had begged for the spotlight. Now the blinding glare of the truth was burning them alive. The press cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing every single angle of their humiliation. The elite titans of industry they had worshipped were looking down on them like vermin. Their public image, their social aspirations, and their fraudulent empire had been completely, permanently eradicated in less than 3 minutes. The war was over, and I had left absolutely no survivors. The silence in the pavilion was absolute thick enough to choke on. The air conditioning hummed faintly above the sea of frozen guests. Richard Vance halted his retreat toward the exit. He turned back toward the VIP table, his face a mask of aristocratic fury. He did not care about social decorum anymore. He cared about severing his legacy from a sinking, burning ship before the flames reached his own reputation. Julian Richards' voice carried across the silent room, cutting through the heavy air with the precision of a scalpel. "I am contacting our estate attorneys the moment I leave this building. You are completely stripped of your board seat. Your trust is frozen. Do not attempt to return to the family compound. You are no son of mine." Eleanor Vance did not even look back. She marched out of the glass pavilion, her heels clicking sharply against the marble, leaving her son to face the wrath of a billionaire he had foolishly tried to extort. Julian crumpled forward, his forehead hitting the white linen tablecloth. He let out a pathetic guttural sob, his hands grasping at his hair. At the back of the massive pavilion, the heavy brass handles of the main doors clicked open. The valet staff stepped aside quickly, their eyes wide. A perfectly synchronized line of uniformed Atlanta police officers marched into the room. Their silver badges caught the light of the floating candles. Behind them, 2 federal marshals in plain clothes stepped through the threshold, their eyes locking immediately onto the Washington family table. A collective murmur of panic and morbid excitement swept through the crowd of elites. The press pool went absolutely wild. Camera shutters fired like machine guns, the rapid flashes illuminating the room in strobes of stark white light. The journalists realized they were not capturing a corporate surrender. They were documenting the greatest high society takedown of the decade. I leaned into the microphone. The cold metal grazed my lips. My father introduced me as a freeloader at a wedding I paid for. I said, my voice echoing off the glass walls, cold and steady. He stood in front of many of the people in this very room and claimed I was a selfish, ungrateful burden who contributed nothing to the family legacy. I paused, letting the weight of the memory hang in the air. I looked down at Desmond. He was sweating profusely, his chest heaving under his velvet tuxedo. Valerie had covered her face with her hands, hiding from the relentless, blinding flashes of the paparazzi. "Let me reintroduce my family to you all." I continued, my voice rising with absolute lethal authority. "A corporate thief, a real estate forger, and a mob-indebted extortionist." The words rang out like gunshots. The Atlanta elite, the venture capitalists, the media moguls, they all stared at the broken figures sitting at the VIP table. The social execution was flawless. I had not just ruined them financially, I had stripped them of their dignity, their connections, and their freedom in front of the exact high society audience they had spent their entire miserable lives trying to impress. "You planned this," Tiara hissed. Her voice was raspy, trembling with a mixture of terror and unhinged fury. She slowly pushed her chair back, the metallic scraping sound cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. Her silver designer gown caught the harsh spotlight. "You set us up. You invited us here just to destroy us." I invited you here to collect exactly what you earned, Tierra, I replied smoothly. You wanted a public stage. I gave you a public stage. You wanted a payout. I am paying you with a prison sentence. Tierra's mind completely shattered. The fragile, arrogant illusion she had built her entire life around snapped into a million jagged pieces. She realized she was not walking out of this botanical garden with a promotion. She was not walking out with a massive settlement check. She was not going shopping for designer bags in the morning. She was walking out in handcuffs, and she was never coming back. She let out a piercing, animalistic scream. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated madness. "I will kill you!" Tierra shrieked. She lunged forward. She vaulted over the VIP table, kicking expensive crystal champagne flutes and silver caviar platters out of her way. She charged the stage with terrifying speed, her hands hooked into claws, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She intended to drag me down from the podium and tear me apart right in front of the cameras. I did not even flinch. I did not step back. I stood perfectly still, watching her charge with cold detachment. Before Tierra's foot even touched the first wooden step of the stage, Elias Thorne moved. He was a blur of calculated, devastating kinetic energy. He launched himself off the side of the stage, intercepting her midair. Elias violently tackled Tierra to the ground. The impact was sickeningly loud. Tierra hit the polished marble floor with a heavy thud, her breath driven from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Elias pinned her face down against the cold stone, twisting her arm painfully behind her back. The delicate seam of her custom-beaded silver gown ripped down the side, scattering loose diamonds across the floor. "Get off me!" Tierra screamed, thrashing wildly against Elias's massive weight. "Let me go! She ruined my life. She stole everything from me." "You stole from yourself," Elias growled, pressing his knee firmly between her shoulder blades, completely immobilizing her. "Stay down!" The uniformed police officers rushed forward from the back of the room, their heavy boots thundering against the marble floor. They surrounded the VIP table. Desmond tried to stand, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of surrender, but an officer grabbed his shoulder and forced him roughly back against his chair. Desmond Washington, Valerie Washington, Julian Vance, and Tierra Vance. The lead federal marshal announced, his voice projecting clearly over the chaotic screams of my sister. "You are all under arrest. We have federal warrants for corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, real estate forgery, and extortion." Valerie began to hyperventilate. She clung to Desmond's tuxedo jacket, sobbing uncontrollably as a female officer pulled her manicured hands behind her back and clamped cold steel handcuffs around her wrists. "Simone, please," Valerie wailed, looking up at the stage with mascara streaming down her cheeks in dark, ugly rivers. "Please, we are your family. You cannot do this. We will give the money back. Just tell them to let us go. I will do anything." "You are not my family," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You are parasites, and you have finally been extracted." Julian did not fight. He simply held his hands out, staring blankly ahead as the cuffs locked around his wrists. He knew the federal prison system was actually safer than the streets of Atlanta right now. The mob enforcers waiting outside his luxury condo would not be able to reach him in federal custody. He welcomed the arrest. It was the only thing standing between him and a shallow grave. Two officers hauled Tierra up from the marble floor. She was breathing heavily, her carefully styled hair a tangled, chaotic mess. The stolen diamonds around her neck sparkled mockingly in the bright lights of the police flashlights. She glared up at the stage, her chest heaving, her eyes filled with a venomous, unrepentant hatred. "You think you won?" Tierra spat, struggling against the iron grip of the arresting officers. "You think this makes you a hero? You are nothing but a cold, ruthless monster." "I am exactly what you made me, Tierra," I answered softly, though the microphone carried the words clearly through the massive pavilion. "You taught me that survival requires absolute ruthlessness. You taught me that mercy is a weakness. I was an excellent student." The officers began marching them down the center aisle. The red carpet that was supposed to be their runway to high society glory was now their pathway to a holding cell. The billionaires, senators, and socialites stepped back in disgust, parting like the Red Sea to let the disgraced family pass. The press corps flooded the aisle, shoving microphones into Desmond's face demanding quotes, and snapping thousands of photographs of Tiara's ruined gown and Valerie's tear-stained face. They documented every agonizing second of their destruction. I watched them walk out the glass doors. I watched the flashing red and blue lights of the police cruisers illuminating the dark botanical gardens outside the pavilion. I watched the doors swing shut, sealing them outside my world forever. They were gone. The nightmare they had inflicted upon my life for 3 decades was permanently over. The silence slowly returned to the ballroom. The flashing cameras ceased as the press rushed outside to get footage of the squad cars pulling away. The remaining guests turned back toward the stage, looking up at me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. I had just publicly decimated my own bloodline without breaking a sweat. I had proven that Simone Washington was not a victim, not a stepping stone, and certainly not a target to be trifled with. I adjusted my suit jacket, took a long, steadying breath, and looked out over the sea of powerful executives. "I apologize for the dramatic interruption to our evening," I said, my voice smooth, polished, and completely professional. As I stated earlier, my firm prioritizes absolute transparency and uncompromising ethical standards. We have swiftly removed the toxic elements from our corporate structure. Now, if you will direct your attention to the screens, I would like to unveil the Washington Foundation's new philanthropic initiatives for the upcoming fiscal quarter. In the back corner of the room, Arthur Sterling raised his glass of vintage champagne, a slow, deeply approving smile spreading across his face. The power shift was absolute. The empire belonged solely to me. 1 week later, the sky above Atlanta broke open. Torrential rain hammered against the slate roof of my Buckhead estate, transforming the winding, manicured driveway into a slick river of dark asphalt. Thunder rattled the reinforced glass of my floor-to-ceiling windows, but inside the atmosphere was a sanctuary of absolute climate-controlled silence. The federal indictments had hit the news cycle with the force of a Category 5 hurricane. Tiara and Julian had been denied bail, deemed extreme flight risks due to their offshore accounts and criminal syndicate ties. They were currently sitting in separate, sterile federal holding cells, waiting for a trial that would undoubtedly end their lives as they knew them. Desmond and Valerie had been granted a temporary, heavily monitored release on house arrest, purely because their assets had been completely frozen by the federal government. They had absolutely nowhere to run. Their bank accounts were seized. Their credit cards were declined. The high society friends they had spent decades worshipping had blocked their numbers and threatened them with trespassing charges if they ever approached their properties. I sat in my leather armchair reviewing the final acquisition contracts for my latest subsidiary when the soft melodic chime of my private security intercom broke the silence. I pressed the flashing blue button on my desk console. "Yes, Elias." "Ms. Washington." Elias Thorne's voice came through the speaker, crisp and entirely devoid of emotion. "We have a situation at the main gate. The perimeter cameras are showing 2 unauthorized individuals. It is your parents. They are requesting access." "Put the feed on my main monitor," I instructed, leaning back in my chair. The large, high-definition screen on my wall flickered, switching from financial data to the live feed from the front gate. The night vision cameras cut through the torrential downpour, illuminating the heavy wrought iron gates that separated my estate from the rest of the world. Kneeling in the mud, completely exposed to the freezing, relentless rain, were Desmond and Valerie Washington. They looked absolutely pathetic. The bespoke velvet tuxedos and rented emerald silk gowns were gone. Desmond wore a soaked, oversized raincoat that clung to his shivering frame. Valerie's hair, usually styled with immaculate, expensive precision, was plastered flat against her skull. The heavy rain washed away whatever makeup she had managed to apply, leaving her face pale, haggard, and stripped of all its arrogant superiority. They were grasping the iron bars of my gate like desperate prisoners. "Simone." My mother's voice cracked over the intercom speaker. It was distorted by the wind and rain, but the raw, unadulterated desperation was unmistakable. "Please, Simone, you have to let us in. We have absolutely nothing left." Desmond leaned into the call box, his chest heaving. His voice, once a booming instrument of intimidation and control, was reduced to a pathetic, wet wheeze. The feds took the cars, Simone. They froze the accounts. The lawyers will not even return our calls unless we produce a cash retainer. You proved your point. You won. Please just let us inside out of the storm. I stared at the monitor. For 30 years, these two people had treated me like an infectious disease. They had mocked my ambition, drained my resources, and relentlessly championed my sister's fraudulent existence while throwing me to the wolves. They had stood in my house, eaten my food, and told me I was a bitter, useless disappointment. Now they were kneeling in the mud at my gate, begging for the very shelter they had always claimed I was unworthy of building. Keep the gates locked, I told Elias. I will handle this personally. I stood up, adjusting the cuffs of my tailored silk blouse. I walked out of my study, my footsteps echoing softly against the imported hardwood floors. I retrieved a heavy, solid black umbrella from the brass stand near the front door. I did not put on a coat. I did not need one. I stepped out from the heavy oak double doors of my mansion and opened the umbrella. The rain hammered against the tight nylon canopy like a drum. The storm was violent, chilling the air, but I felt nothing but a profound, radiating heat of absolute vindication. I walked slowly down the long, winding driveway. The security floodlights tracked my movement, casting long, sharp shadows across the wet pavement. As I approached the iron gates, Desmond and Valerie saw me. They scrambled to their feet, pressing their faces against the cold, wet metal bars. Simone, thank God, Valerie cried out, reaching a trembling, soaked hand through the narrow gap in the ironwork. Please, sweetheart, we are freezing. We are your parents. You cannot just leave us out here to die in the street. The media is parked outside the condo. We had to walk 3 miles in the rain just to get here. Desmond nodded frantically, water pouring down his face. We surrender, Simone. Whatever you want. We will sign whatever documents you need. We will publicly testify against Julian and Tierra if that is what it takes. Just give us a place to sleep and a lawyer. You are our daughter. You have a duty to help us. I stopped exactly 3 feet from the gate, remaining perfectly dry beneath the wide canopy of my black umbrella. I looked at the hands reaching through the bars. I looked at the desperate, hollow eyes of the people who had given me life and then spent the next 3 decades trying to crush it. I reached into the pocket of my slacks and withdrew a single folded piece of heavy, water-resistant paper. It was an official court-stamped document. I stepped forward and slid the paper through the iron bars. Desmond snatched it greedily with his shivering, wet fingers. He fumbled to unfold it, holding it up to the harsh glare of the security floodlights. Valerie leaned in close, squinting through the rain to read the bold black text printed across the top. It was not a check. It was not a retainer agreement for a defense attorney. It was a formal, immediate notice of eviction. Desmond's eyes widened in horror as his brain struggled to process the legal terminology. "What is this?" he stammered, his jaw trembling. "This is an eviction notice for the Buckhead condo. Simone, you do not own that property. The bank owns it." I looked him dead in the eye, my voice cutting through the roar of the thunderstorm with razor-sharp clarity. "You forged my signature to take out a fraudulent second mortgage on my grandmother's house," I said, my tone as cold and hard as the iron bars separating us. "The moment you were arrested, the bank initiated immediate foreclosure proceedings to seize the asset. I could not allow a piece of my grandmother's legacy to be auctioned off to cover your pathetic criminal mistakes." Valerie gasped, covering her mouth with her hands. "So yesterday morning, I continued, my voice steady and completely relentless. I contacted the bank executives. I silently paid off the entire balance of your fraudulent mortgage in cash. I purchased the debt, and I legally reclaimed the deed to my grandmother's house. I am now the sole undisputed owner of the Buckhead property." Desmond's hands shook so violently the paper nearly tore. "You cannot do this. That is our home. Where are we supposed to go?" "You have exactly 24 hours to vacate my property," I commanded, stepping closer to the bars so they could see the absolute lack of mercy in my eyes. "If you are not entirely off the premises by midnight tomorrow, Elias and his security team will physically throw you and your remaining possessions onto the sidewalk." Valerie fell back to her knees in the mud, letting out a broken, agonizing wail that was immediately swallowed by the thunder. She clutched the iron bars, resting her forehead against the cold metal. Simone, please, we have no money. We have no family left. We have absolutely nothing. I looked down at them for the very last time. I felt no pity. I felt no guilt. I felt the heavy, suffocating chain that had bound me to these people finally snap and fall away. My father introduced me as a freeloader at a wedding I paid for, I said, recalling the exact moment this war had escalated. You called me a bitter, useless disappointment. You told me that Tiara was the only child who truly mattered. Well, Tiara is going to federal prison. And as for me, I paused, letting the rain wash over the silence between us. This is the only help the useless daughter will ever give you, I finalized. I turned my back on them. I did not listen to their screams. I did not listen to Valerie begging or Desmond shouting empty, pathetic threats. I simply walked away. I walked back up the long, glowing driveway beneath the shelter of my black umbrella, leaving them to the storm they had created. The heavy oak doors of my mansion closed silently behind me, sealing the chaos outside. The grand foyer was warm, quiet, and smelling faintly of cedar and expensive wax. I handed my wet umbrella to a waiting member of my household staff and walked directly into my private study. I crossed the room to the polished mahogany wet bar. I picked up a heavy crystal decanter and poured myself a generous measure of a vintage, deeply complex red wine. The liquid glowed like dark rubies in the soft light of the room. I took the glass and walked over to the massive floor-to-ceiling windows. The storm raged against the glass, but the thick panes blocked out all the sound. Far in the distance, cutting through the heavy rain and the dark night sky, the magnificent glowing skyline of Atlanta stood tall and unconquered. The toxic ties that had held me back my entire life were permanently severed. The leeches had been burned away. The empire was secure. My grandmother's legacy was safe, and the Washington family name now belonged solely to me. I took a slow, deep sip of the red wine, savoring the rich, heavy taste. I looked out over the city that I had fought so brutally to conquer. I was entirely free and seen,